The desert is supposed to be silent at night, but that's a lie I believed until the silence started listening back. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and in March of 2021, I was 38 years old, driving a weathered Volkswagen Vanagon west until the map ran out of promises. I had lived most of my life in places where noise covered your mistakes. Freeways, neighbors, televisions murmuring in the background. But the desert strips all of that away. It leaves you alone with the sound of your own thinking. That was the reason I chose Joshua Tree National Park, or at least that's what I told myself. The truth was quieter and heavier. I had just come out of a long winter where nothing moved forward. Work stalled. Relationships thinned. Sleep became something I negotiated with instead of entered naturally. The idea of parking a small VW camper under an open sky felt like an answer that didn't require words, just space, just distance. I arrived late in the afternoon, that liminal hour when the rocks turn the color of old rust and the Joshua trees stretch like figures caught mid-sentence. The campground was sparsely occupied, 2 rigs far off, dots against the land, and the ranger station sign warned about wind, cold nights, and animals bold enough to test your locks. I nodded at it like a formality. Warnings always feel theoretical in daylight. I chose a spot backed up against a cluster of boulders. The Vanagon sighed as I shut it off, metal ticking as it cooled. That sound, cooling metal, has always felt like a body settling into sleep. I cooked a simple dinner on the stove, ate it standing up, and watched the sun disappear behind the rock formations. When the light finally dropped away, it did so all at once, like someone snapping off a switch. Night in Joshua Tree isn't dark the way cities imagine darkness. It's clean, sharp. The stars don't twinkle, they stare. The air temperature fell faster than I expected, and the smell of the desert changed, from warm dust to something mineral, almost metallic. I pulled on a jacket, stepped outside, and listened. At first, nothing. Then whined, threading its way through the rocks, producing low moans that felt accidental but intentional at the same time. I told myself that was the sound people romanticize. I told myself that fear only lives where people do. Inside the van, I latched the doors out of habit, not concern. The locks clicked with a hollow confidence. I climbed into the narrow bed, my shoulder brushing the wall, and turned off the interior light. The dark pressed close immediately. In a vehicle that small, you don't feel enclosed. You feel held or trapped. The difference depends on your state of mind. Sleep didn't come easily. The desert has a way of keeping your senses awake even when your body begs to shut down. Every sound felt closer than it should have been. A rustle could have been a mouse or the wind or something bigger negotiating the ground. I kept telling myself the same thing over and over. You wanted this. You came here to feel small. Sometime after midnight, the temperature dropped hard. Cold seeped through the van's thin insulation and into my joints. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter, curled inward, and finally drifted into something shallow and uneasy. That's when the first sound came. Not loud, not sudden, just deliberate. A single knock. It landed on the side of the van with a dull, padded weight. Not a tap, not the scrape of a branch. A knock, the way someone knocks when they expect an answer but don't want to announce themselves. I froze. Every muscle locked at once, like my body had practiced for this without telling me. I held my breath, listening for a follow-up that didn't come. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself, like the desert was waiting to see how I'd respond. I told myself it was an animal. That explanation arrived quickly, eagerly. Animals bump into things. Animals are curious. Animals don't knock. I ignored that last thought and focused on the first two. I reached for my phone. The screen glowed too bright in the dark, throwing sharp shadows across the van's interior. 2:14 a.m. The numbers looked unreal, like they belonged to someone else's night. I dimmed the screen and waited. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds stretched themselves into something larger. Time in fear doesn't behave normally. It folds in on itself. I started to relax just enough to feel foolish. Then the second knock came. Same spot, same pressure, same patient intent. My heart kicked hard against my ribs, loud enough that I was sure it could be heard outside. This time, the sound carried something else with it, a faint vibration through the metal, as if whatever touched the van had weight. More than a raccoon. More than wind. I slid out of the sleeping bag slowly, every movement calculated. The floor was cold under my feet. I crouched, peering through the front windshield. The moonlight painted the campground in silver and black, shadows stretching long and distorted across the sand. My headlights reflected nothing but empty space. No footsteps, no voices, just the rocks and the trees standing still, pretending they hadn't noticed anything. A smell drifted in through the cracked window. Not animal, not rot. Something sour and human adjacent, like old sweat soaked into fabric and left too long in heat. I hadn't smelled it earlier. The realization settled into my stomach like a dropped stone. I told myself I was projecting. The mind fills in gaps when it's afraid. That's what I'd always believed, that fear is creative. Another sound followed, not a knock this time, but a slow drag along the side panel. Fingertips, or something shaped like them. The metal gave a soft, protesting whine as the pressure moved from the rear toward the driver's door. I backed away instinctively, my shoulder hitting the cabinet. The van felt smaller now, tighter, like it was shrinking around me. I thought about the locks. I thought about how thin the walls were. I thought about how far the nearest occupied campsite might be and how sound behaves in open desert. A rational part of me tried to take control. Don't react. Don't announce yourself. Don't turn on lights. I crouched there, barely breathing, counting my heartbeats like they were seconds I could spend. The dragging stopped. Silence returned, but it was wrong now. Charged. Expectant. I felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. The desert pressed in from all sides, the rocks looming like witnesses that had seen worse and learned not to interfere. Then came a sound that broke something open inside me. A whisper. Not words. Just breath. Right outside the driver's side door, close enough that I could hear the wetness in it. I covered my mouth without realizing I was doing it, as if my own breathing might answer back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to drive, to do anything, but fear had glued me in place. I thought about all the times I'd ignored that instinct in the past, written it off as anxiety, overreaction, imagination. The whisper stopped, replaced by a slow, careful knock. This one landed directly over the door handle. And in that moment, crouched in the dark of my Volkswagen with the desert holding its breath around me, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever was outside knew exactly where I was. The knock over the door handle lingered in the air long after the sound itself faded, like a question I didn't know how to answer. I stayed frozen, knees bent, muscles trembling from the effort of holding still. My mind raced through options that all felt equally impossible. Turning the key would make noise. Opening the door was unthinkable. Calling out felt like an invitation. The desert doesn't reward boldness. It absorbs it. Another whisper slid through the crack in the window. Closer this time. Almost affectionate. It wasn't language. It was cadence. The rise and fall of breath shaped like speech, but empty of meaning. As if whoever or whatever was outside had learned the rhythm without the words. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the windshield and stared into the night, trying to make sense of shapes that refused to organize themselves. The Joshua trees looked like figures caught mid-motion, arms lifted, fingers spread. I had laughed at that comparison earlier in the evening. Now they felt like a crowd pretending not to watch. A memory surfaced without warning. Something my father used to say when I was a kid, camping in the Sierra Nevadas. If something wants you to know it's there, it'll make noise. If it wants you to come out, it'll be polite. At the time, I'd thought it was just one of his stories that I can try a way to keep me close to the fire. Now, crouched in a van barely thicker than a tent, those words felt like a warning delivered too late. The door handle shifted, not pulled, tested. Metal clicked softly, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the open air. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like falling. The locks held, but only just. I imagined fingers curling around the handle, patient, curious, learning the boundaries of the machine I was hiding in. I scrambled backward, bumping into the small table, knocking over a mug I'd forgotten to stow. It clattered against the floor, loud and sharp in the silence. The sound seemed to echo forever. Everything stopped outside. No breathing, no movement. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the desert itself was listening now. I realized then that I had made myself known. There was no pretending I wasn't inside anymore. The van had gone from shelter to signal in a single careless second. Seconds passed, maybe more. I don't know how long I waited, heart hammering, ears ringing with my own pulse. The cold crept back in, my hands shaking uncontrollably now, adrenaline turning against me. Then footsteps began to circle the van, slow, deliberate, crunching softly over gravel and sand, too steady to be an animal, too close to the body of the van. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, each step measured, unhurried. I followed the sound as it moved, my head turning instinctively, as if I could track it through the metal. It passed the rear doors, paused, then continued toward the passenger side. The smell returned, stronger now. That sour, human-adjacent scent mixed with dust and cold air. A hand pressed flat against the side panel. Not knocking this time, just contact. The van creaked in response, a low groan that felt almost like pain. I imagined fingerprints left behind, heat transferred through the metal, proof that this was real and not something my mind had invented in the dark. The hand slid upward, slowly, until it reached the window. The glass fogged almost instantly. I stared at the spreading cloud of condensation, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. The shape was unmistakable. Someone leaning in, face close, breathing steadily against the glass. A shape formed within the fog. Not clear, just the vague suggestion of a forehead, a nose, a mouth too close to see properly. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt them on me anyway. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to scream. Panic pressed in from all sides now, drowning out reason, logic, every plan I'd rehearsed in calmer moments. The urge to flee burned through me, hot and desperate. When I opened my eyes again, the fog was gone, so was the hand. The footsteps retreated a few paces, then stopped. Silence rushed back in, but it was different now. Strained, brittle, ready to shatter. I didn't wait for the next move. I lunged for the driver's seat, my body acting before my mind could argue. The key was already in the ignition. I twisted it hard, praying the engine would turn over on the first try. It didn't. The starter coughed weakly, the sound heartbreakingly small in the vast night. My heart slammed against my ribs, panic cresting into something close to hysteria. Outside, something moved fast. A shadow crossed the windshield, too tall, too narrow. I didn't look long enough to understand it. I didn't want to. I tried the ignition again. This time, the engine caught. The roar felt deafening, obscene, like shouting in a cathedral. Headlights flared to life, blasting the campground in white light. The beam cut across rocks, trees, empty ground, and then something stepped back into the shadows. I didn't see a face. I didn't see features. Just the outline of a person-shaped absence, darker than the darkness around it, retreating just far enough to stay out of the light. I slammed the van into gear, tires spinning briefly before finding purchase. Gravel sprayed behind me as I lurched forward, heart in my throat, hands slick on the wheel. As I sped down the dirt road, bouncing over ruts, I checked the mirrors again and again, expecting to see movement, pursuit, anything. There was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road swallowed by darkness. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement. I drove for over an hour before pulling over, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the engine off. When the silence finally returned, it felt unreal, like I'd stepped into a different world entirely. I sat there, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, breathing in short, broken gasps. My body trembled with the aftermath, adrenaline draining away and leaving behind exhaustion and something heavier, shame, maybe, or disbelief. I told myself over and over that I had survived, that whatever had happened back there was over now, that I was safe. But safety is a fragile concept once it's been broken. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the horizon lighten with dawn, every sound making my shoulders tense. When the sun finally rose, it felt like permission to exist again. Later, when I checked the van in daylight, I found marks along the side panel, smudges where something had pressed against the metal. Too high to be an animal, too deliberate to be windblown debris. I didn't report it. I didn't tell a ranger. I didn't stay in Joshua Tree another night. Some experiences resist explanation, and forcing them into neat boxes can feel like another kind of denial. What mattered was what I carried away from that place, not the fear itself, but the lesson buried inside it. Out there, alone in the desert, I had ignored my instincts because I wanted quiet more than truth. I wanted solitude to fix what distance never could. The desert had answered in its own way, stripping away my illusions and reminding me that awareness is not paranoia, it's survival. I still camp. I still love the open road, the way a Volkswagen van feels like a promise on wheels, but I listen differently now. I trust the unease when it arrives quietly. I don't wait for proof when my body already knows, because sometimes the knock isn't asking to be let in. Sometimes it's asking if you're paying attention. I didn't realize how deeply that night had lodged itself inside me until weeks later, long after the desert dust had been washed from the tires and the van smelled like coffee and road miles again instead of cold metal and fear. I was parked outside a grocery store in Flagstaff, engine off, radio low. A man walked past the van, close enough that his shadow slid across the windshield, and my body reacted before my mind could intervene. My chest tightened. My hand went to the door lock. My breath shortened. For a split second, I was back in Joshua Tree, counting heartbeats in the dark. That's when I understood the night hadn't stayed in the desert. It had come with me. I tried to explain it away, the way I always had, with logic, with statistics, with the comfort of probability. Joshua Tree is vast. People wander where they shouldn't. There are transients, smugglers, night hikers, voices that carry strangely in dry air. Any of those explanations could have fit if I'd wanted them badly enough, but none of them explained the patience. None of them explained the way the knocking had felt intentional, not curious, not frantic, just measured, as if whoever stood outside my Volkswagen already knew how the night would end and was willing to let me catch up. For a long time, I told myself the lesson was simple. Don't camp alone. Lock your doors. Leave when something feels wrong. Those are the kinds of lessons that fit neatly into checklists and campfire conversations. They're comforting because they suggest control. But that wasn't the real lesson. The real lesson was harder to accept. I had ignored the first warning long before the knock ever came. It was there in the way the campground felt too empty for a Friday night, in the way the ranger sign lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. In the way the desert quiet didn't soothe me, it sharpened me. My body had known something my mind refused to hear because I wanted the trip to mean something. I wanted solitude to be healing instead of honest. The desert doesn't care what you want. It reflects you back at yourself, stripped of noise and excuses. And that night it reflected my own stubbornness, my habit of rationalizing discomfort instead of respecting it. Months later, I returned to California, not to Joshua Tree, but close enough that the land began to look familiar again. The same wide skies, the same rocks standing like ancient sentries. I camped with others that time, vans clustered together like a small, fragile village. Laughter carried, fires burned. It felt safer. But even then, when night fell, I listened. I listened to the wind, to footsteps, to the way silence shifts when something enters it. I noticed how my senses sharpened without tipping into panic. Fear had rewired me, but it hadn't broken me. It had tuned me. I started to understand that fear, when it's quiet and precise, isn't the enemy. It's a signal, a language older than reason, designed to keep us alive in places where logic arrives too late. The memory of the fogged window still visits me sometimes, usually in dreams. I never see a face there, just the shape of breath against glass, the suggestion of presence without identity. I wake up before it resolves, heart pounding, sheets twisted around my legs. In those moments, I don't feel helpless the way I did that night. I feel alert. I get up, I check the locks, I step outside and look at the sky if I can. I ground myself in what's real, what's here, what I can see and touch. I remind myself that I escaped because I finally acted, not because I understood, but because I listened. That's the part people don't talk about when they romanticize the open road. They talk about freedom, about escape, about finding yourself out there under endless skies. They don't talk about what happens when the land finds you first. RV camping teaches you humility if you let it. It teaches you that walls are thin, that comfort is temporary, that nature isn't a backdrop, it's an active participant. Most nights, it's indifferent. Sometimes it's generous. And once in a while, it tests you, not with monsters or madness, but with moments that ask a single quiet question. Are you paying attention? I still drive my Volkswagen like it's a promise. I still pull into campgrounds as the sun sets, still feel that familiar mix of anticipation and calm. But I don't chase silence anymore. I respect it. I don't assume solitude is safe just because it's beautiful. And if something knocks in the night, if the air changes, if my skin prickles for no clear reason, I don't argue with myself the way I used to. I don't wait for certainty. I don't need proof. Because some doors, once tested, don't need to be opened to teach you everything you need to know. That night in Joshua Tree didn't take anything from me, but left something behind, a deeper awareness, a sharper listening, and the understanding that survival, out there and in here, often depends on trusting the fear that arrives quietly before it ever has to knock again. The first thing I felt when I opened my eyes wasn't fear. It was the weight of being watched, the kind that presses down on your chest before your mind has even figured out why. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and in October of 2019, I was 36 years old, camping in the Smoky Mountains in a Volkswagen camper van I'd rebuilt with my own hands. It was an old VW Westfalia, faded green paint, manual pop top, the kind of van people romanticize because it looks like freedom. That van had carried me through deserts, coastlines, and quiet national parks where the nights felt clean and honest. I trusted it. I trusted myself even more. That trust is what almost kept me from surviving that morning. I'd parked at a small, unofficial pull-off just outside a primitive campground boundary in eastern Tennessee. Locals knew the spot, no signage, no facilities, just a gravel clearing pressed into the trees by years of quiet use. The Smokies in October smell like wet leaves and cold earth, and that night the fog had rolled in early, thick enough to swallow the tree line by sundown. I remember thinking it felt like the mountains were holding their breath. I told myself that was just the season. I was traveling alone. That matters. When you're alone, you narrate everything in your head. You become your own witness, your own skeptic, your own liar. I'd cooked dinner on a small propane stove, shut the doors, latched the windows, and climbed into the narrow bed with the sound of distant wind moving through the ridges like slow water. Somewhere far off, an animal cried out, long, hollow, almost human if you let your imagination get ahead of you. I didn't. I've always believed fear comes from exaggeration, from people letting stories replace reality. That belief shaped every decision I made that night. Sometime before dawn, I woke up, not from a sound, not from a dream, just awake. The inside of the van was ice cold. My breath hung in front of me, pale and faint. The little battery-powered clock on the dash glowed dim red, 4:37 a.m. The fog outside had thickened into something solid, pressing against the windows like a damp hand. For a moment, I lay there listening, counting the seconds between my breaths. That's when I noticed the silence. The mountains are never truly quiet. There's always something: wind, insects, leaves shifting, distant water. But that morning, everything had stopped. No insects, no wind, not even the trees creaking. Silence like that doesn't happen naturally. It's a reaction. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff from the cold rack, and that's when I smelled it. Not rot, not smoke. Something sour, metallic, like damp iron and old sweat. I told myself it was the van. Old vehicles have personalities. They trap smells. They invent them. I pulled on my jacket and leaned forward to wipe the condensation from the side window with my sleeve. I wish I hadn't. Outside, pressed into the thin layer of mud and fallen leaves, were footprints, not scattered, not passing through, encircling the van. They were everywhere, dozens of them, overlapping, pacing, turning back on themselves. Some close enough to the door that whoever made them would have been standing inches from where I slept. They weren't animal tracks, no claws, no pads, bare feet, adult-sized, some larger, some smaller, all distinct. My mouth went dry so fast my tongue stuck to the roof of it. I scanned the perimeter, moving my head slowly so the fog didn't catch the motion. The prints didn't lead anywhere. No trail in, no trail out, just around. Like something had walked circles again and again while I slept. That's when the denial kicked in. Maybe locals messing around, maybe hikers cutting through in the night, maybe I'd parked near some kind of ritual site. Kids, college students, Halloween coming up. The Smokies attract every kind of myth chaser this time of year. I stacked explanations in my head like sandbags against a flood I didn't want to acknowledge. But my body didn't buy any of it. My hands were shaking. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I realized then that I hadn't heard footsteps during the night. No movement, no voices, no laughter. Nothing had brushed the van, no knocking, no accidental contact. Whatever had been out there had known how to move quietly. I shifted my weight and the van creaked. Immediately from somewhere just beyond the rear doors, I heard a sound, a slow exhale, not a breath from an animal, not a sigh from the wind, controlled, intentional, close. I froze, every muscle locking at once, my mind screaming at me to stay silent. I held my breath, counting the seconds again. 1, 2, 3. Another exhale. This one closer to the driver's side window. Then a soft scraping sound, skin against metal. I closed my eyes, not because I thought it would make it go away, but because some instinct told me that seeing too much would make it worse. I thought about the latch on the doors, the thin glass, the fact that my keys were in the front console, not in my hand. I thought about how stupid I'd been to camp alone without telling anyone exactly where I was. The scraping stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. Minutes passed, maybe seconds. Time started folding in on itself. My legs were numb. My hands ached from gripping the edge of the bed too tightly. Somewhere deep in my chest, something ancient was waking up. Something that didn't care about logic or pride or explanations. It just wanted me to live. I forced myself to move inch by inch, careful not to make the van rock. I reached forward and wrapped my fingers around the keys. They felt impossibly loud in my hand. I didn't look back out the window. I didn't want to confirm whether the footprints were still there or whether something else had replaced them. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught one last smell through the cracked window seam. That same sour metallic scent, stronger now, like something had leaned in close. I turned the key, the engine hesitated. For half a second, I was certain this was where it ended, where denial finally cashed its check. Then the van roared to life, loud and ugly and beautiful. Headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the clearing in a harsh white beam. And that's when I saw them, not just the footprints. The shapes standing just beyond the light, motionless, watching. Their faces were still hidden by the fog, but they didn't move away. They didn't need to. They already knew where I was. Their silhouettes didn't rush me. That was the worst part. They stood there like they'd been carved out of the fog itself. Tall, uneven shapes, some hunched, some too straight, all wrong in ways my brain struggled to categorize. The headlights caught only fragments. A shoulder here, the suggestion of a head there, limbs that seemed too long or held at angles people don't naturally choose. No eyes reflected back, no movement, just presence. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, shaking so badly I thought I might stall the engine myself. For a split second, a sick, traitorous thought crossed my mind, that maybe if I waited, if I stayed still, they'd leave. That maybe this was some misunderstanding, some local ritual, some harmless mountain weirdness that only felt terrifying because I was alone and half awake. That thought died when one of them stepped forward. Just one step. slow, deliberate. The fog parted around its legs like water. I slammed the accelerator. The van lurched forward, tires spitting gravel, the engine screaming in protest as I swung hard toward what I remembered was the dirt access road. The headlights bounced wildly, catching flashes of pale skin, bare feet retreating, or maybe advancing. It was impossible to tell. The shapes didn't scatter like startled animals. They moved with patience, as if they knew I only had one way out. The road was narrower than I remembered. Trees crowded in on both sides, their branches clawing at the van, screeching against the metal like fingernails. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, painful bursts that burned my throat. In the side mirror, I saw movement. Not running, walking. Several figures slipping between the trees, keeping pace somehow, appearing and disappearing as the fog swallowed them whole and spit them back out again. No matter how fast I went, they were there, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never close enough to touch, never far enough to escape. That's when the knocking started. It came from the inside of the van. 3 soft taps, right behind me, from the rear panel. I almost lost control of the wheel. My mind raced through impossible explanations. The van shifting, loose equipment, thermal contraction from the cold, anything but what my gut already knew. I didn't look back. I refused to give whatever was behind me the satisfaction. Another knock. This one closer to my ear, on the inside of the wall, inches from my head. "Stop," a voice said. Not shouted, not whispered. Calm. It sounded human in the way mannequins look human from a distance, close enough to fool you until you notice what's missing. There was no accent I could place, no age, no emotion behind it. Just the word, spoken like a suggestion rather than a command. "Stop. You'll get hurt." Something in my chest cracked open then, not fear, but anger. Raw and sudden. I'd spent my life trusting strangers, trusting places, trusting that experience made me safe. That voice felt like every bad decision I'd ever brushed off talking back to me. I floored it. The road dipped sharply and the van went light for a terrifying second before slamming down hard enough to rattle my teeth. The knocking stopped. The voice disappeared. All I could hear was the engine and my own heartbeat pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The trees began to thin. I saw a break in the fog ahead, faint, gray, unreal. The promise of open space. Then the smell came back, strong, overwhelming, like rust and wet soil and something long confined suddenly exposed to air. It filled the van, made my eyes water, my stomach lurch. I gagged, one hand flying to cover my mouth as panic threatened to tip me over the edge into something useless. The headlights swept across the road just as something stepped into my path. I hit the brakes on instinct, the van skidding sideways, tires screaming. The figure stood dead center in the beams, close enough now that the fog couldn't hide it. It was naked, completely. Skin pale to the point of translucence, stretched tight over sharp angles. Its feet were caked with mud and leaves. Its arms hung too low, fingers brushing its knees. And its face, there was nothing wrong with its features. That was what made it unbearable. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, all in the right places, all working, but empty, flat, like they'd never learned how to mean anything. It tilted its head slowly, studying me, lips parting. Behind it, more shapes gathered at the edge of the light, watching. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just let go of the brakes. The van surged forward and the figure didn't jump away. It stepped aside at the last possible second, so close I heard the rush of air as I passed. In the side mirror, I saw it turn, not startled, not angry, just curious, like I'd failed a test it didn't expect me to pass. The road finally spilled out onto pavement. The sudden smoothness jolted me almost as much as the fear. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the sun was climbing over the ridgeline and the fog burned off like it had never existed, until normal sounds returned. Birds, distant traffic, the world pretending nothing had happened. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there shaking, forehead pressed to the steering wheel, breathing in air that smelled like gasoline and burnt coffee and safety. When I finally got out, My legs nearly buckled under me. That's when I noticed the back of the van. Handprints covered the rear panel. Dozens of them, some large, some small, all smeared as if whoever left them had been pressing hard, holding on. I didn't take pictures. I didn't call the police. I didn't go back. I drove until the mountains flattened into hills and then into something forgettable, something that didn't watch you back. I still camp. I still drive that van. But I don't camp alone anymore. I don't ignore the silence when it falls too suddenly. And I never, ever trust a place just because it looks peaceful in daylight. Because some things don't chase you. They wait. I stayed at that gas station until my hands stopped shaking enough to hold a paper cup without crushing it. Morning commuters came and went, their faces tired and ordinary, and I watched them like someone observing a different species. I wanted to grab the nearest stranger and tell them everything about the footprints, the breath on the window, the voice inside my van, but the words felt contaminated, like saying them out loud might make the whole thing real in a way I wasn't ready to survive. So I didn't talk. I cleaned the back of the van instead. I used paper towels from the restroom, scrubbing until my arms burned. The handprints didn't come off easily. The mud was mixed with something oily, something that smeared instead of lifting. When I finally finished, the metal looked clean, but the smell lingered. That sour, iron-heavy scent had soaked into the seams, into the rubber around the doors. I drove with the windows down, even though the air was cold enough to sting my face. I told myself it would fade. It didn't. For weeks afterward, every sound felt like a warning. Wind brushing the side of the van made my pulse spike. Footsteps outside grocery stores made me turn too fast, scanning for bare feet where there should have been shoes. I stopped sleeping deeply. I'd wake up at the slightest change in temperature, convinced something was standing just beyond the glass. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the doubt. In daylight, with distance and normalcy pressing in, my brain started filing the experience away under stress, exhaustion, misinterpretation. I replayed it obsessively, looking for cracks. Maybe it had been a group of locals messing with me. Maybe some fringe survivalist community. Maybe I'd imagined the voice, projected it from my own panic. But doubt doesn't erase what your body remembers. Every time I thought about the way those figures moved, not hurried, not aggressive, my stomach dropped. Predators don't always chase. Sometimes they observe, sometimes they learn. I went back to camping a month later against my better judgment. Different state, different terrain. A small, regulated campground with posted rules and visible neighbors. Families, campfires, laughter. I thought proximity would protect me. That first night, I lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of people settling in. Zippers. Low conversation, a baby crying somewhere down the loop. I waited for my body to relax. It didn't. Sometime after midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly, not gradually, like weather does, but sharply, like someone had opened a door. I sat up, breath fogging instantly, heart already racing. Outside, the campground was quiet, the fires burned down to embers. And then I smelled it. Faint, almost imagined. Rust. Damp earth. I didn't look out the window. I couldn't. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle locked, listening until dawn crept in and the normal smells returned. In the morning, there were no footprints, no marks, no evidence. That was when I understood something that took me longer than I'd like to admit. What happened in the Smoky Mountains wasn't an isolated incident. It was an introduction. The Smokies have a reputation, ancient, dense, layered with stories people half believe, because fully believing them would mean accepting that some places don't belong to us, no matter how many roads we carve through them. Those mountains are older than memory, older than names, and they don't care about our rules or our confidence. I'd wandered into a place that noticed me, and noticing goes both ways. I started talking to other campers, carefully, casually, not about what I saw, but about strange nights, unexplained feelings, moments when instinct overrode logic. More people than I expected hesitated before answering. More than a few changed the subject. But some, usually the older ones, the quiet ones, met my eyes, and nodded. One man in his 60s camping near the Blue Ridge told me he never stayed in one place more than 2 nights anymore. When I asked why, he said, "Because the third night is when you start to feel welcome, and nothing good ever comes from that." I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't need him to. I'm not telling this story to scare you away from the road. I still believe in what RV camping represents: the freedom, the self-reliance, the connection to places that remind us we're small. But small doesn't mean insignificant, and it definitely doesn't mean invincible. There's a difference between courage and arrogance. I crossed that line in the Smokies because I trusted my experience more than my instincts. I ignored the silence. I dismissed the unease. I stayed because I didn't want to feel foolish. That almost cost me everything. Now, when I camp, I arrive earlier. I watch the light fade. I pay attention to smells, to sudden changes in sound, to that subtle tightening in my chest that says something isn't right. I leave if I need to, no matter how inconvenient it feels. Pride doesn't keep you safe. Awareness does. Sometimes late at night, when the world goes still in that particular way, I think about those footprints circling my van, about the patience in their movements, about the voice that told me to stop, not threatening, not angry, just confident, as if it already knew the mountains would see me again. Because places like that don't forget you. They just wait to see if you've learned. And if you're listening closely enough, you can hear them breathing. The desert doesn't go quiet all at once. It thins out, sound by sound, until you realize the silence has been watching you longer than you've been watching it. My name is Ethan Calder, and in July of 2020, I was 36 years old, burned out from a life that felt too loud in all the wrong ways. I'd been working remote jobs before it was normal, stacking deadlines on top of insomnia, and convincing myself that movement counted as healing. That summer, I bought a used Volkswagen Rialta, sun-faded paint, engine whining like an old dog, but solid enough to carry me and my partner Mara across the map and away from the noise we thought was killing us. We weren't chasing danger. That's the lie people tell after. We were chasing space. Slab City had always been one of those names that lingered in my head like a rumor you're not sure you heard right. An off-grid community in the Sonoran Desert, no rules, no utilities, a place where people went when the rest of the world didn't make sense anymore. We didn't plan to stay long, just one night, maybe 2. Park near the outskirts, keep to ourselves, sleep under stars that didn't care who we were. By the time we rolled in, the heat was still clinging to everything like a second skin. Even after sunset, the air felt thick, metallic, as if the desert was holding its breath. The ground radiated warmth through the soles of my shoes. The sky was wide and bruised purple, stars beginning to pierce through. I remember thinking how exposed everything felt. No trees, no shadows deep enough to hide in. Just open land and scattered silhouettes of abandoned trailers, half-built structures, and art installations that looked like they'd grown out of the sand rather than been placed there. We parked farther than most, where the ground flattened out and the noise, if you could call it that, dropped to almost nothing. Almost. Somewhere far off, music pulsed, not loud enough to follow, but steady, like a heartbeat you didn't trust. Occasionally, a gust of wind dragged sand against the side of the RV, a dry whisper that made the metal skin shiver. Mara asked if I was sure about this place. She didn't say it with fear, more like a test. She knew I needed to believe this trip was a good idea. I told her it was just one night. That was the first lie. We cooked inside, windows cracked, fans doing more noise than good, the smell of dust mixed with canned food and hot plastic. Sweat stuck to my back. Every sound felt closer than it should have been. The click of the stove, the thud of a cabinet door, the faint crunch of footsteps somewhere that definitely wasn't us. I told myself it was other campers. Locals. People moving around like they always do. Denial is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just smooths the edges of things you don't want to think about. By 11:30 p.m., the desert cooled enough to let us breathe. We turned off the lights inside the RV to keep from drawing attention, leaving just a small amber glow over the sink. Outside, the darkness pressed up against the windows like a held hand. That's when the smells changed. The desert has a clean, mineral scent at night, usually. This was different. Something sour drifted in through the cracked window. Stale sweat, rust, maybe old oil. Human, unmistakably human. It made the back of my throat tighten. Mara noticed it too. I could tell by the way she stopped moving. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. I nodded, even though whispering felt ridiculous in a place this open. We sat still, listening. The distant music had stopped. The wind died down. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt organized, like it was waiting for something specific. Then came the footsteps. Slow, unhurried, crunching gravel and sand in a deliberate rhythm, circling wide at first, then closer. Each step sounded heavier than it should have been, like someone leaning their weight forward, dragging time behind them. I wanted to look out the window. I didn't. There's a moment when fear asks you a question. Do you really want to know? I chose not knowing. The steps paused near the rear of the RV. I heard fabric brush against metal, a hand maybe, the faint squeal of pressure. My chest tightened so hard it felt like my ribs were folding inward. Mara reached for my arm. Her grip was ice cold. I told myself it was curiosity. Someone checking out the rig, someone harmless. The rationalizations lined up quickly, too quickly. At 12:02 a.m., the handle on the RV door moved. Not rattled, not yanked, turned, slowly. The sound was soft, controlled, almost polite. A gentle test of resistance, like whoever was on the other side knew exactly how much pressure to apply without making noise. The lock held, but the door shifted in its frame just enough to let us hear the rubber seal stretch. My heart slammed so hard I thought it would give us away. Mara's breathing went shallow, panicked. I could feel her shaking through the mattress. Every instinct in my body screamed to do something, shout, bang on the door, turn on the lights, but another voice, colder and sharper, told me to stay silent. The handle turned again. This time, harder. The RV rocked slightly, a subtle sway that felt obscene in its intimacy. Whoever it was leaned in, testing not just the lock, but us, our willingness to respond, to reveal ourselves. The smell grew stronger through the cracks, unwashed skin, something chemical underneath. I imagined a face inches from the door, ear pressed close, listening for proof of life. I realized then how thin the walls were, how little separated us from whatever had decided we were worth investigating. A soft knock followed. 3 taps, measured, patient. Not the knock of someone lost or asking for help. It was the knock of someone who already knew we were inside. My mouth tasted like copper. I thought about the stories I'd brushed off before coming here. The warnings disguised as jokes. The way locals talked about the desert like it chose who stayed and who didn't. The handle twisted again. This time it didn't stop right away. I heard the metal strain, felt the vibration travel through the door into the floor, into my bones. The RV creaked, protesting in small, helpless sounds. Mara buried her face against my chest to muffle a sob. And in that moment, with the desert pressing in from every direction and the door between us and a stranger growing weaker by the second, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. Running away from noise doesn't mean you find peace. Sometimes you just find a quieter place for fear to speak. The handle stopped moving, but the pressure didn't disappear. It lingered, held there, like a finger resting on a trigger. Time stretched thin. I counted my own breaths because it was the only thing I could still control. 1, 2, 3. Each inhale scraped hot air through my lungs, tasting like dust and rust and fear. The silence inside the RV felt louder than any scream. Even the refrigerator seemed to hold its hum out of respect for what was happening. Then I heard the man breathe. It wasn't loud. It wasn't exaggerated. Just a slow exhale through the nose, close enough that I could tell he was standing square to the door. The realization hit me harder than the attempt to open it. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't frantic. He was calm. People who are calm at midnight in places like this scare me more than anyone else. Mara's nails dug into my arm. I could feel her silently pleading with me to do something, anything. but my mind was locked in a brutal tug-of-war. Every instinct screamed, "Don't engage," while another part of me whispered that if he knew we were awake, and he absolutely did, silence might not save us. The knock came again. This time, 2 taps, closer together. Impatient. The door handle shifted once more, firmer now, the metal clicking softly as if he'd learned something about the lock from the first attempts. The RV rocked again, not from force, but from intention, his weight leaning in, testing boundaries the way predators do. And then he spoke. "Hey," he said, voice low, almost gentle. "I know you're in there." The words slid through the thin walls and wrapped themselves around my spine. His voice sounded dry, worn, like it had spent too many years talking to empty space. Not drunk, not frantic, just sure. Mara flinched. I felt her breath hitch. "I just want to talk," he continued. "Door's open, right?" He laughed softly at his own joke. I don't know why that laugh did it, but something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the way he assumed access. Maybe it was the way he spoke like the RV already belonged to him. Or maybe it was the accumulated weight of every bad decision that had led us here, parked in the dark, pretending the world couldn't touch us. I leaned close to Mara's ear and whispered, barely shaping the words, "Stay quiet. Don't move." I slid off the bed slowly, like every muscle trembling with the effort of restraint. The floor felt cold under my bare feet, a shock against the heat that had soaked into me all day. I moved inch by inch, keeping my weight balanced, listening for any change in his breathing that might tell me he heard. The man outside shifted. I heard fabric scrape against the door again, followed by the soft clink of something metal brushing the handle. Not a tool exactly, more like a key ring, maybe. Something he was using to probe, to feel. "You don't gotta be scared," he said, though there was no warmth in it. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The way he said hurt made my stomach drop. It wasn't a promise. It was a concept he was considering. I reached the small cabinet near the sink and opened it silently, fingers closing around the only thing that felt remotely like a weapon. A heavy metal flashlight, dented from years of use. It felt useless and comforting at the same time. Another knock, harder now. 3 sharp raps that echoed inside the RV like a gunshot. Mara gasped before she could stop herself. Outside, the breathing stopped. Everything stopped. The desert seemed to lean in. I heard the man shift his stance, boots grinding into the sand as he adjusted his weight. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The softness was gone. "There you are," he said quietly. "See? Wasn't so hard." The handle jerked violently. The lock held, but barely. The doorframe groaned, a low, desperate sound that made my teeth ache. He yanked again, harder, frustration bleeding through his restraint. The RV rocked more noticeably now, cabinets rattling, something clinking onto the counter behind me. Panic flooded my chest, hot and immediate. My thoughts scattered, tripping over each other. I pictured the door giving way, his body filling the narrow space, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I flicked on the interior light, the RV flooded with harsh yellow illumination, exposing every corner, every shadow. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some primitive belief that light could push him back. Or maybe I needed to stop imagining what he looked like. The handle froze. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the man laughed again, but this time it was sharp, edged with irritation. "Well," he said, "there you are." I stepped closer to the door, flashlight clenched in my hand, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My mouth opened before my fear could stop it. "Get away from the door," I shouted, my voice cracking despite my effort. "You're not welcome here." Silence answered me. Then slowly, deliberately, his shadow passed across the frosted window in the door. Tall. Lean. Close enough that I could see the vague outline of his head tilt, as if he were studying me through the glass. "Ah," he said softly. "That's not very neighborly." Something scraped along the side of the RV, fingernails maybe, or a piece of metal dragged just hard enough to scream. The sound crawled up my spine, raising goosebumps along my arms. I heard footsteps move away from the door, circling now. Slow again. Controlled again. The worst kind of calm returning, thicker than before. Mara whispered my name, panic bleeding into every syllable. "I know," I whispered back. "I know." The footsteps reached the back of the RV, then the side, then stopped beneath the window near the bed. A shadow appeared there too. This one lingered. The smell grew stronger again, seeping in like smoke. I realized he was close enough to touch the glass, close enough to look in if he wanted. "I could hear you breathing," he said conversationally. That's how I knew. My chest tightened painfully. Every breath suddenly felt too loud, too obvious. "I just want to come in," he continued. "You don't want to be alone out here. Not like this." The words hit something deep and ugly inside me, because part of me, some exhausted, broken piece, had come out here because I felt alone, because I'd thought isolation might be safer than connection. The desert didn't correct that mistake gently. The footsteps resumed, faster now, impatience finally winning out. They returned to the door, heavier than before. The handle rattled violently, metal clanging against metal as he tried something new, something stronger. The lock screamed. Mara sobbed openly now, no longer able to hold it in. And as the door shuddered under the strain, I realized with sick clarity that this wasn't going to end with him giving up. It was going to end with a decision. Mine. The decision didn't arrive as a clear thought. It slammed into me like a reflex, raw and animal, born from the certainty that waiting was no longer an option. The door bucked again, harder this time. I heard the unmistakable sound of something inside the lock slipping, metal giving way in tiny, irreversible increments. The RV trembled, protesting in short, frightened creaks. My Volkswagen, my illusion of shelter, suddenly felt like a soda can being crushed between fingers. "Mara," I whispered, forcing calm into my voice like it was a physical thing I could hand her. "Shoes. Now." She nodded too fast, tears streaking down her face, hands shaking as she fumbled for her sneakers. Her fear mirrored mine, but sharper, because I wasn't just afraid of dying. I was afraid of failing her, afraid that my choice to bring us here to prove something to myself was about to cost us everything. Outside, the man grunted with effort. The handle twisted violently, jerking up and down as if he were trying to tear it free by force. The lock screamed again, an ugly metallic shriek that clawed at my nerves. I braced my shoulder against the door without thinking, flashlight raised uselessly in my right hand, my body already knowing what my mind refused to say out loud. He slammed his weight into the door. The impact threw me backward, my shoulder exploding with pain as I stumbled into the narrow aisle. The door bowed inward, just enough for me to see the seal gape, just enough to let the desert air rush in, hot, foul, carrying that same human stench that now felt suffocating. "Open it," he barked, the calm finally gone. "Don't make me." Another slam. The lock snapped. The sound was small, almost delicate, a quiet click that felt louder than any explosion. The handle turned freely. Mara screamed. I lunged forward, back, slamming my palm against the door just as it began to open. The man shoved back from the other side, stronger than I expected, his weight relentless. The door crept inward inch by inch, my muscles burning, my teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. I caught my first real glimpse of him through the widening gap. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes sunk deep and reflecting the RV's interior light with a flat, predatory focus. His beard was patchy, sweat darkened. He smiled when he saw me, not wide, not manic, just enough to show he was enjoying this. "There you are," he said again, softer now, intimate. "Knew you'd come say hi." The smell hit me full force, old sweat, ammonia, something rotten underneath. It made my eyes water. I slammed the flashlight into his face. The crack of metal against bone was sickening, reverberating up my arm. He howled, stumbling backward, hands flying to his head. I didn't wait to see how badly he was hurt. "Run!" I shouted. Mara bolted toward the rear emergency exit as I kicked the door shut with everything I had, jamming a folding chair beneath the handle on instinct. It wouldn't hold long, I knew that, but it didn't need to. It just needed to hold long enough. The back hatch flew open, flooding the RV with moonlight and desert air. We tumbled out into the sand, heat rising from the ground even now, the night alive with distant echoes and the sudden violence of our movement. Behind us, the man roared. Pure rage now, pain sharpening it into something feral. The chair inside the RV crashed to the floor as he shoved the door again. We ran. Barefoot sand burned my feet, sharp and uneven. Every breath felt like fire in my lungs. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might black out, but I couldn't slow down. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, disorienting in its openness, the darkness swallowing landmarks whole. I didn't know where we were going. I only knew we couldn't stop. Footsteps thundered behind us, heavy, fast, too close. Mara stumbled, nearly falling, and I grabbed her arm, yanking her upright without breaking stride. Panic stripped thought down to fragments. Don't look back. Don't stop. Don't die here. A shape loomed ahead, another RV, lights off, silent as a grave. Beyond it, faint glows marked a cluster of encampments farther in, a scatter of human presence like distant stars. We angled toward the light. The man shouted behind us, words dissolving into curses, breath ragged now. His footsteps faltered, slowed. I risked a glance back and saw him bent over slightly, one hand pressed to his face, blood dark against his beard in the moonlight. Our terror had cost him something, but he didn't stop. We reached the edge of the encampment, voices suddenly cutting through the night, someone laughing, a radio crackling to life. I screamed then, raw and unfiltered, the sound tearing out of me without permission. Heads turned, lights flicked on, shadows moved. The man skidded to a halt. For a moment, we all stared at each other across the sand. Me, Mara, the strangers emerging from the darkness, and him, standing alone, bleeding, exposed. His eyes locked onto mine. There was no apology there, no regret, only promise. Then he backed away, step by careful step, melting into the desert like he'd never been there at all. The adrenaline didn't fade gently. It crashed. My legs gave out, dumping me into the sand as Mara collapsed beside me, sobbing uncontrollably. Hands grabbed my shoulders. Strangers asking questions I couldn't answer. Voices blurring together. Someone wrapped a blanket around us, though the night was still warm. I couldn't stop shaking. The RV was abandoned until morning. No one wanted to go back out there in the dark, and I didn't argue. I couldn't imagine stepping inside that metal shell again. Not with the memory of his hands on the door burned into my mind. When dawn finally crept across the desert, pale and indifferent, we returned with others. The RV door hung crooked, lock destroyed. Inside, the place looked violated. Drawers open, chair overturned, a smear of blood on the door frame where the flashlight had connected. He hadn't taken anything. He hadn't needed to. We left Slab City that morning without saying a word to each other. The engine whining as we pulled away, the desert stretching behind us like nothing had happened. But something had. Fear doesn't stay where it's born. It follows you. It settles into quiet moments. It waits. And as the miles rolled by, one truth pressed heavier than the heat ever had. The wilderness doesn't test your courage. It tests your honesty. About why you're there, about what you're running from, and about whether you're willing to listen when your instincts tell you it's time to leave. We drove for hours without speaking, the desert unspooling behind us like a memory already trying to erase itself, and I kept waiting for my hands to stop shaking, but they didn't. Not even when the sun climbed high enough to bleach the fear out of the landscape and make everything look harmless again. Morning in the desert is a liar. It smooths over the violence of the night, softens the sharp edges, makes you feel foolish for having been afraid at all. The sand looks ordinary. The sky looks generous. Even the abandoned places seem less threatening, like props left behind after a bad dream. But my body didn't believe the daylight. Every time the RV creaked, my shoulders tensed. Every vehicle that passed too slowly made my pulse spike. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see him back there, somehow keeping pace, his promise unfinished. Mara finally broke the silence somewhere past the Salton Sea. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw by crying and shock. "You knew it was wrong," she said quietly, not accusing, just stating a fact. I nodded, eyes fixed on the road. The The truth sat heavy in my chest. I had known, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not with flashing warning signs or sudden dread. I'd known in the small ways, the tightness in my stomach when we pulled in, the way I ignored the smell, the way I talked myself out of leaving when the silence turned sharp. I had mistaken stubbornness for bravery, isolation for peace. That man didn't create the danger. He revealed it. We didn't stop until we reached a proper campground, one with marked sites, ranger signs, other people who nodded politely and kept their distance. Civilization felt strange after the night before, too organized, too loud, too safe in a way that almost felt insulting. I slept that afternoon, but it wasn't rest. Every time I drifted off, I felt the door flexing under my hands again, heard the quiet click of the lock giving up, smelled him, too close, unavoidable. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced for a split second that I was back there, that the walls were thin again. The nightmares didn't stay in Slab City. They followed us north, into gas stations, into parking lots, into places that should have felt secure. I caught myself scanning faces, cataloging movements, measuring intent in the way people walked. The world felt newly populated by threats I'd never bothered to notice before. And then there was the guilt. It settled in slowly, heavier than the fear. I had brought Mara there. I had insisted it would be fine. I had needed that night to mean something, to prove that I could still choose adventure, still outrun whatever dissatisfaction had been gnawing at me. Instead, I'd handed our safety over to chance and called it freedom. Weeks later, long after we'd left California behind, I found myself replaying one moment again and again. Not the struggle, not the chase, but the way he'd laughed. That soft, knowing laugh like he'd already decided how the night would end. What haunted me wasn't just what he'd tried to do. It was how close I'd come to letting it happen. Because the truth is, danger rarely kicks down the door without warning. It waits, it tests, it watches how much you're willing to ignore. RV life teaches you a lot about yourself. You learn how thin comfort really is, how fragile routine becomes when your walls can move and your locks are just suggestions. You learn that the line between solitude and vulnerability is razor thin and that the environment doesn't care about your intentions. The desert that night wasn't evil, it was indifferent. And indifference is far more dangerous than malice. I started researching places differently after that. I listened more, asked locals the questions I used to brush off. If something felt wrong, even slightly, I didn't argue with it anymore. I learned that instinct isn't fear, it's memory working faster than logic. Mara and I talked about leaving RV life altogether. For a while, every road felt like a gamble, but slowly, carefully, we found our way back. Not to recklessness, but to respect. Respect for distance, for limits, for the quiet voice that says this isn't the place. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind hits the side of the RV just right, my body still reacts before my mind can catch up. Muscles tighten, breath shortens, the past presses close, but I don't ignore it anymore. Because the night near Slab City taught me something I carry with me every mile since. Freedom isn't about going where you want. It's about knowing when to leave. It's about understanding that not every open space is an invitation, and not every silence is peace. Some places don't want witnesses. Some nights are better left untouched. And sometimes the most dangerous stranger you'll meet on the road is the version of yourself that refuses to listen when the world is warning you to get out. That night didn't end when the sun came up. It ended when I finally admitted the truth. I wasn't haunted because someone tried to open our RV door. I was haunted because for too long I'd been the one leaving it open. The first thing I noticed wasn't the dark. It was the sudden absence of sound, like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. My name is Ethan Holloway. I was 36 that summer, and I'd been RV camping long enough to believe I understood silence. I'd chased it across deserts, into pine forests, along forgotten highways where radio stations faded into static and your own thoughts grew too loud. Silence, I thought, was something you earned out there, something peaceful, something honest. Custer State Park proved me wrong. I arrived in late August, driving a weathered Volkswagen camper I'd rebuilt myself over the years. Old engine hum, manual windows, that familiar smell of dust, oil, and sun-warmed upholstery. The park rolled out in front of me like a postcard that had decided to stay quiet. Granite spires cut into a pale sky. Tall grass moved in slow waves. Bison grazed in the distance with a calm that felt ancient and indifferent. I told myself this was the reset I needed. No deadlines, no noise. Just a few nights parked among strangers who weren't really strangers, because RV campers understand each other without talking much, or at least that's what I believed then. I checked in just before dusk. The ranger, a woman in her 50s with sun-creased skin and a voice worn thin by repetition, looked at my reservation longer than necessary. Site 47, she said finally. Quiet area. Her eyes stayed on mine a second too long. Not warning. Not fear. Just consideration. Quiet's why I'm here, I said, smiling. She nodded, but didn't smile back. The road to Site 47 curved through thick stands of ponderosa pine. As I drove, the forest closed in, not aggressively, just enough to remind me that I was the guest here. The light thinned, shadows stretched, my tires crunched over gravel that sounded louder than it should have. When I pulled into the site, I noticed something odd right away. No music. Most campgrounds, even the quieter ones, carry a low hum after sunset. Someone's radio drifting through the trees. Kids laughing. The clink of cookware. Here, there were other RVs spaced out among the trees, but no sound traveled between them. It felt less like courtesy and more like agreement. I parked, leveled the camper, and stepped outside. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with pine sap and something mineral like cold stone. The temperature dropped fast as the sun disappeared behind the hills, and with it went the last excuse for daylight. Still, I told myself, nothing unusual. Parks like this attract people who want solitude. People like me. I cooked a simple dinner. Beans, bread, coffee I didn't need but wanted anyway. Everything felt normal, familiar. The way it always does when you're surrounded by objects that carry your history. It wasn't until around 11:30 p.m. that the unease started to settle in. I was lying on the narrow bed, window cracked just enough to let in air, when I realized I couldn't hear insects. No cicadas, no crickets. Even the wind had stopped brushing the trees. I sat up listening. The silence wasn't empty. It was tight, pressurized, like standing underwater and waiting for your ears to pop. I told myself it was just elevation, weather, coincidence. The rational part of my brain lined up explanations like sandbags against a rising tide. I'd driven all day. I was tired. My senses were exaggerating things. Then, somewhere off to my left, a door closed. Not slammed, not rushed, just the solid, deliberate thud of an RV door being shut by someone who didn't need to hurry. I waited for footsteps. Voices, anything to follow it. Nothing did. Midnight came and went. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. The clock on the dashboard glowed a soft green, numbers steady and indifferent. 12:47 a.m. I started drifting, that half sleep where thoughts unravel and the body forgets its weight. That's when I noticed something else missing. No generators. At campgrounds, there's always at least one, someone who needs air conditioning or can't sleep without noise. Here, every engine was dead, every power source silent. At 12:59 a.m., I became fully awake for no clear reason. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. My skin felt too tight, like I'd been running, even though I hadn't moved. I stared at the clock, 12:59. The forest outside felt attentive. Then the minute changed, 1 a.m. And whatever fragile background noise still existed vanished completely. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was as if someone had flipped a switch on the world. No distant highway, no shifting branches, no night birds. Even my own breathing sounded wrong, too loud, like a disruption. I sat up slowly, every instinct telling me not to move fast, not to announce myself. The silence pressed in from all sides, thick enough to feel against my ears. That's when I smelled it. Not smoke, not rot, metal, cold and sharp like old pennies rubbed together. It drifted in through the cracked window, faint but unmistakable. I stood and stepped toward the door, careful not to let the hinges creak. My hand hovered over the lock, hesitation blooming into fear I didn't want to name yet. Outside, something shifted. Not walking, not an animal, more like weight redistributing, as if the ground itself had adjusted. I froze, hands still inches from the handle. A thought surfaced, uninvited and unwelcome. Everyone else is awake too. I don't know how I knew that. I just did. I pressed my forehead lightly against the door, listening through the thin metal. My breath fogged the surface, and for a moment I imagined I saw another shape on the other side, breathing back. The smell of metal grew stronger. Then, somewhere deeper in the campground, an RV engine tried to turn over. It coughed once, twice, and died. The sound echoed far longer than it should have, stretching unnaturally through the trees before being swallowed whole by the silence again. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself to stay put, to wait it out. That panic creates patterns where none exist. But another part of me, the part shaped by years of listening to the road, knew this wasn't nothing. This was a boundary being crossed. And at exactly 1 a.m., something in Custer State Park had decided we'd crossed it together. I stood there in the dark, barefoot on the cold floor of my camper, realizing for the first time that silence isn't always the absence of sound. Sometimes it's the presence of something listening. I stayed pressed against the door longer than I meant to, counting my breaths, trying to decide whether fear was making me imagine things or sharpening my senses beyond comfort. The metal smell crept deeper into the camper, mingling with the familiar scent of old fabric and coffee grounds, corrupting it. My fingers tingled, not numb exactly, but hyper-aware, as if every nerve ending had leaned forward to listen. Outside, the silence didn't loosen. It held. I forced myself to unlock the door. The click sounded violent in that quiet, like snapping a bone. I paused, waiting for a response, some correction from the night for daring to make noise. Nothing came. I opened the door slowly. Cold air slid in, carrying that metallic edge more clearly now. The campground lay under a thin wash of moonlight, RVs scattered like pale, sleeping animals between the trees. No lights were on. No silhouettes moved behind curtains. It struck me then that every window I could see was dark. Too dark. Not even the faint glow of a phone screen. I stepped down onto the gravel. It felt colder than it should have, the stones biting into the soles of my feet. The forest loomed close, pines rising like dark spines against the sky. I listened hard, expecting the world to correct itself, to bring back the normal sounds of night. It didn't. I took a few cautious steps forward. Each footfall sounded wrong, muffled, as if the ground were swallowing noise on purpose. My heart thudded, loud enough that I worried it might carry. I glanced toward the nearest RV, maybe 20 yards away. A large fifth wheel, newer than mine, expensive, the kind owned by someone who liked control. I found myself hoping that person was awake, watching, feeling what I felt. As if summoned by the thought, a shape shifted behind the windshield. I froze. The movement was slow, deliberate, not someone sitting up suddenly, startled, more like someone leaning forward, closer to the glass. Moonlight caught the curve of a forehead, the bridge of a nose. I opened my mouth to call out, "Hey," but the word died before it formed, because the shape didn't stop at the glass. It pressed against it, not a hand, not a face. Pressure, enough to bow the reflection, to distort it slightly, like something testing the barrier. Then it eased back. The interior of the RV went dark again, indistinguishable from the others. I backed away without taking my eyes off it, retreating toward my own camper. A wave of embarrassment followed close behind the fear. Anger at myself for letting imagination run wild. People do strange things at night. Maybe someone had leaned forward to look out, nothing more. But my body didn't believe that explanation. My shoulders stayed tight. My stomach churned. When I reached my camper, I climbed back inside and locked the door, twisting the bolt harder than necessary. I sank onto the bed, knees pulled to my chest, listening. That's when the knocking started. It came from the far end of the campground at first. Not loud, not urgent. A slow, hollow thump, that traveled through the ground more than the air. I felt it in my spine. One knock, a pause, another. The rhythm wasn't random. It had space between each sound, as if whoever or whatever was making it expected an answer. I waited for voices to follow. Someone yelling, laughing, complaining, anything human. Instead, another knock joined in, closer this time, then another farther away, echoing the same deliberate pace. The campground became a map of soundless distances, each knock marking a point surrounding us. I checked the clock again. 1:07 a.m. The rational part of me clawed for control. Maybe maintenance crews, maybe trees dropping branches. But branches don't knock with intent, they don't wait. I pressed my ear to the wall of the camper. The metal vibrated faintly with each impact, carrying information I didn't want to understand. Then, directly behind me, something knocked on my own door. 3 times. Slow, even, polite. My breath caught painfully in my chest. The smell of metal surged, thick enough now that my eyes watered. I backed away from the door, my heel catching on the edge of the rug, nearly sending me down. The knocking came again. Same pattern, same patience. I stared at the thin strip of light at the bottom of the door, moonlight leaking in. A shadow passed over it, briefly, then settled. Someone was standing there. I wanted to believe it was another camper. Someone confused, someone needing help. That belief fought hard, dragging up every lesson I'd learned about not assuming the worst. But the silence outside was absolute. No shifting weight, no breath, just presence. I'm not dressed, I said finally, my voice cracking on the words. It sounded absurd even to me, an excuse offered to the dark. No response. The knocking resumed, a little firmer now. Not angry, insistent. My phone lay useless in my hand. No signal, no comfort. I considered the emergency whistle clipped near the door, but the idea of breaking the silence felt wrong, like it would invite something worse. Another knock echoed somewhere else in the campground, then another. A chorus, still staggered, still patient. I realized then that this wasn't about me alone. Whatever was happening, it was happening to all of us, simultaneously, in our own pockets of fear. The knocking at my door stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened. My muscles screamed from holding tension too long. I risked another glance at the clock, 1:14 a.m. A soft sound replaced the knocking. Not scraping, not breathing, sniffing, right outside the door. Slow, deliberate inhalations as if something were learning my scent. The metal smell peaked, sharp enough to taste, coating my tongue. I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the wall. Panic finally broke through whatever fragile dam I'd built. My thoughts scattered, primitive and loud. Don't open it. Don't move. This will end if you let it. The sniffing stopped, then impossibly I heard my name. Not spoken clearly, more like an approximation of sound shaped to resemble it. Wrong in the mouth that formed it. Ethan. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut as if that could undo what I'd heard. My heart felt too big for my chest, pounding against bone. When I opened my eyes again, the shadow under the door was gone. The silence remained. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time felt unreliable now, elastic and untrustworthy. I stayed frozen, listening for any sign that the world was returning to normal. Instead, faintly from somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard movement. Not knocks this time, not sniffing. Footsteps, many of them, all moving in the same direction, away from the campground. And without fully understanding why, I knew with chilling certainty that if I stayed where I was, if I let dawn find me there, I wouldn't leave Custer State Park the same person who'd arrived. Maybe I wouldn't leave at all. I stood, hands shaking, and reached for my keys. My hands fumbled with the keys like they'd forgotten what metal was for. The small jingle sounded obscene in the silence, too bright, too alive. I half expected it to draw attention back to me, to summon whatever had been standing on the other side of the door, breathing me in. Nothing reacted. That frightened me more than the knocking had. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door with excruciating care. The interior of the Volkswagen felt suddenly fragile. Thin walls, old seals, a nostalgia box pretending to be shelter. I pressed the key into the ignition and paused, forehead resting against the steering wheel, listening one last time. The footsteps in the forest continued, steady and unified, fading farther away. Not running, not sneaking, leaving. A question surfaced, sharp and unwanted. What if they're going somewhere safer? I turned the key. The engine coughed once, loud enough that I flinched. The sound seemed to ricochet through the campground, stretching, thinning, until it vanished into the void like everything else. I tried again. Nothing. My chest tightened. I pumped the gas, whispered to the dashboard like it could hear me. The smell of metal still lingered, mixed now with old fuel and anxiety sweat. On the third attempt, the engine turned over, rough and protesting, but alive. Relief crashed through me so hard it made my vision blur. I threw the headlights on. The beams cut through the darkness and landed on faces. Not close, not right in front of me. Farther out, near the tree line, they stood scattered between trunks, half lit, half erased by shadow. Men and women, different ages, different builds, campers, people who had driven here expecting quiet and found something else instead. They weren't looking at me, they were all facing the forest. Their postures were wrong, too still, too attentive. Arms hanging loose, heads tilted slightly forward, as if listening for instructions only they could hear. I swallowed hard and eased the camper into reverse. Gravel crunched under the tires, shockingly loud now that sound had partially returned to my world. A few heads turned at that, slow, mechanical movements, eyes reflecting the headlights briefly before looking away again. None of them tried to stop me. I backed out of Site 47 and turned onto the narrow campground road. As I drove, I passed more RVs, more tents, more people standing barefoot in the dirt, pajamas fluttering in the cold night air. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them looked afraid. That was the worst part. The silence inside the camper broke gradually as I drove, wind noise seeping in through old seals, the engine's uneven rhythm asserting itself. But outside, beyond the cone of my headlights, the park remained unnaturally muted, as if the sound belonged to me alone now. I kept expecting something to step into the road, to force me to stop, to test whether leaving was allowed. Nothing did. When the main road finally appeared ahead of me, a pale ribbon cutting through the dark, my hands were aching from gripping the wheel too tightly. I didn't slow down until I'd crossed the boundary sign, Custer State Park, and watched it disappear in the rearview mirror. That's when the world exhaled. Crickets erupted from the grass like they'd been waiting for permission. Wind rushed through the trees. Somewhere, an owl called out, sharp and real. The sudden return of sound hit me harder than the silence had. I laughed once, a short, broken sound, then pulled over onto the shoulder and put my head in my hands. I stayed there until dawn, engine off, doors locked, watching the sky lighten inch by inch. I told myself I'd imagined parts of it, that fear fills gaps with monsters, that there were explanations I just didn't have yet. At first light, I drove into the nearest town and found a diner already open. The smell of bacon and coffee grounded me more than anything else could have. I sat at the counter, shaking, and ordered food I barely touched. The waitress, early 40s, tired eyes, noticed my hands. "You camp up at the park?" she asked casually, refilling my mug. I hesitated. "Yeah, just left early." She nodded once. "Didn't ask why. Some folks don't stay the night," she said. "Happens every now and then." I studied her face, searching for something. Fear, recognition, denial. "Do you know why?" She looked toward the window where the morning sun was just starting to warm the street. "Place gets quiet," she said. "Too quiet for some people." That was all she offered. I didn't go back to Custer State Park. Not that year. Not any year since. I told myself it was just a bad night, a coincidence wrapped in stress and suggestion. But the truth followed me. For months afterward, I woke at exactly 1 a.m., heart racing, ears straining for a silence that wasn't there. I started camping differently, parking closer to exits, trusting the first flicker of unease instead of rationalizing it away. I learned something out there, something I carry with me every time I turn the key and point my RV toward the horizon. We talk about nature like it's passive, like it's scenery meant to soothe us, reset us, remind us who we are. But some places don't want witnesses. Some places don't roar or threaten or chase you away. They simply wait until you're quiet enough to hear what they're saying and decide whether you're meant to stay. At exactly 1 a.m. in Custer State Park, the campground didn't go silent because nothing was there. It went silent because something was listening. And I was lucky enough to leave before it finished deciding what to do with me. I didn't tell the whole story to anyone for a long time. Not friends, not family, not the people I met later at other campgrounds who traded ghost stories around controlled fires, laughing just a little too loudly. I learned quickly that when you describe something without teeth, no creature, no clear threat, people reach for explanations that shrink it. Weather, wildlife, group psychology, carbon monoxide, sleep paralysis, and I let them. Because the hardest part to explain wasn't what I saw or heard, it was what I felt afterward. The sense that something had measured me, weighed me, and let me go. Not out of mercy, but disinterest. For weeks after South Dakota, I couldn't stand true quiet. I slept with a fan running, windows cracked, even in bad weather. I started leaving the radio on low when I drove, even through places where silence used to feel earned. Every time the world got too still, my body reacted before my mind could intervene, heart racing, skin prickling, that phantom smell of metal rising in my nose. I kept camping, though. That surprised me most. I moved differently after that night. I paid attention to small things I used to dismiss, the way locals avoided certain pull-offs, how some camp hosts spoke in half sentences when you asked about quiet areas, how wildlife noise would sometimes drop off in patterns, not randomly. I learned to leave when that happened, not in panic, not running, just respectfully. There was one night, months later in northern Arizona, when the desert went unnaturally still again. No wind, no insects, the stars sharp enough to cut. I checked the time out of habit, 12:42 a.m. I didn't wait to see what came next. I packed up quietly, hands steady, heart loud but controlled. As I pulled away, the wind returned behind me like a door closing. That's when I understood the real lesson of Custer State Park. Fear isn't always a warning siren. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's your oldest sense recognizing a pattern your logic doesn't want to admit exists. We like to believe the road is ours, that because we can drive it, park on it, sleep beside it, we own the experience. RV culture sells freedom wrapped in steel and rubber, go anywhere, stay anywhere, belong everywhere. But the land doesn't sign those agreements. Some places tolerate us, some welcome us, and some observe. Custer wasn't haunted in the way people like to imagine. No legends carved into brochures, no monsters waiting to be named, just a convergence of silence, timing, and human presence at a moment when something else asserted priority. I think about the people I saw standing at the tree line sometimes. I wonder what happened after I left, whether they went back to their RVs when the night loosened its grip. Whether any of them remember it the way I do, or if memory smoothed the edges, filed it down into something manageable. I hope they left too. I never looked up reports, never searched forums. Part of me didn't want confirmation. Another part knew it wouldn't change anything. Experiences like that don't need validation to stay with you. They lodge deeper than facts. Now, when I camp, I introduce myself to the place the way you would to a stranger's home. I arrive before dark. I listen more than I talk. I leave no trace, not just physically, but emotionally. I don't push into areas that feel closed no matter how beautiful they look on a map. And when night comes, I listen, not for danger, for permission. Because the truth is, silence isn't empty. It's a language. And at exactly 1 a.m. in Custer State Park, the land spoke clearly. It said, "You're not alone. You never were. And staying is a choice, not a right. I chose to leave." Every mile I've driven since has been shaped by that decision. Every campground feels different now, not safer, not scarier, just more honest. I know the line exists, I know how thin it is, and I know what it feels like when you're standing on the wrong side of it. If you camp long enough, you'll feel it too. The moment when the world gets too quiet, when the night stops being background and starts being aware, when the land pauses just long enough to see if you notice. And if you do, that's your moment. Listen to it, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do out there isn't staying through the fear. It's ignoring the silence when it finally speaks. The desert doesn't go quiet the way people think it does. It holds its breath, and when it does, you feel like you're the one suffocating. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 36 that spring, old enough to know better, young enough to still believe solitude could fix things I didn't want to name out loud. I'd been living out of my 1979 Volkswagen Westfalia, sun-faded red, engine whining like a nervous animal, for almost 6 months by then. I told people I was traveling, but the truth was simpler and uglier. I was running from a life that felt too loud, too crowded, too full of expectations I couldn't meet anymore. Sedona was supposed to be a pause, a reset. Red rock, open sky, space to think. I pulled into a dispersed campsite outside town just before sunset, the kind of place locals don't advertise and tourists don't usually find unless they're willing to follow a dirt road longer than feels comfortable. The GPS lost signal about 3 miles in. That should have been my first clue to turn around, but the air smelled like iron and sage, and the light hit the rocks like they were burning from the inside. I convinced myself that discomfort was part of the therapy. I parked the van between 2 low juniper trees, killed the engine, and listened to the ticking metal cool. No other campers, no voices, no generators, just wind moving through brush in a way that felt deliberate, like it was choosing where to touch. I told myself I liked that feeling. I cooked a simple meal as the sun dropped, beans, tortillas, the last of my coffee heated into something bitter and grounding. The temperature fell fast, desert cold, the kind that sneaks up on you. I pulled on a hoodie and sat on the van's rear bumper, watching shadows stretch and overlap until the ground stopped looking solid. Somewhere far off, a sound drifted through the air. It wasn't quite a coyote, too slow, too measured, almost like someone trying to imitate one. I laughed it off, a short, forced sound. People hear things out here. The desert plays tricks. That's what I told myself. By 10:30 p.m., the sky was a hard dome of stars. No moon, just blackness stitched with light. I climbed into the van, slid the side door shut, and locked it, habit more than fear. I lay back on the thin mattress, hands folded on my chest, listening to the world press in from all sides. At 11:46 p.m., the first light appeared. It wasn't a flash. It didn't streak or blink. It simply existed just beyond the passenger side window, hovering maybe 30 feet off the ground. A pale amber glow, soft around the edges, like fog caught fire and decided to hold its shape. I sat up slowly, heart already accelerating before my mind caught up. I told myself it was a drone, someone messing around. Night photography, maybe? Sedona attracts all kinds of people chasing weird experiences. I pressed my face closer to the glass. The light didn't move. It didn't hum. It didn't flicker. It just waited. A second light bloomed to life behind it, slightly higher. Then a third off to the left, forming a loose, uneven triangle. My mouth went dry. The air inside the van felt suddenly stale, like it had been sealed for hours instead of minutes. I reached for my phone. No signal. The screen's glow felt obscene in the dark, like lighting a match in a cave. I turned the brightness down and checked the time again, as if it might have changed. It hadn't. The lights began to drift, not together, not in any pattern I could recognize. One dipped lower, another slid sideways, the third rose just enough to break whatever symmetry they'd accidentally formed. Their movement was slow, intentional, the way something moves when it knows it doesn't need to hurry. My chest tightened with a familiar, unwelcome sensation, the old internal argument. Don't overreact. You're tired. You came out here to face fear, remember? I'd always prided myself on being rational. That was my shield, even after the divorce, even after the panic attacks I refused to name. I believed that if I could explain something, it couldn't hurt me. So I opened the driver's door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and metallic. The smell hit me immediately. Ozone, like the moment before a storm, completely wrong for a clear desert night. I stepped down onto the dirt, boots crunching softly, every nerve in my body screaming that I was making a mistake. The lights reacted. The lowest one shifted closer, closing the distance by half in a way that made my stomach lurch. Still silent, still smooth. No propellers, no cables, no visible source. The surface wasn't solid exactly. It looked layered, like light stacked on itself. Depth where depth shouldn't exist. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin, foreign. The word didn't echo. It felt like the desert swallowed it immediately, like it had weight and didn't want to carry it. That was when I noticed the temperature. The air around me wasn't just cold. It was uneven. Pockets of chill moved across my skin, crawling up my arms, down my neck, like I was standing in invisible currents. My breath fogged, then didn't, then did again, out of sync with everything else. I took a step back toward the van. The lights followed. Not aggressively, not fast. Just enough to let me know the space I thought was mine wasn't. Panic didn't hit all at once. It seeped in through cracks, through the realization that my keys were still inside, through the way my hands started to tremble despite my efforts to steady them, through the sudden, overwhelming certainty that I was being observed, not watched, but assessed. I slammed the door shut and locked it, the sound too loud in the silence. The van rocked slightly as I scrambled inside, heart pounding hard enough to hurt. I killed the interior lights and crouched by the rear window, peering out through a gap in the curtain. The lights had multiplied. 5 now. 7. Maybe more. They dotted the landscape in an uneven ring around the campsite, hovering at different heights, different distances, as if each one had chosen a specific angle. The smell of ozone intensified, seeping through the seals, mixing with old upholstery and dust until my head swam. A sound started then. Not from the lights, but from the desert itself, a low, rhythmic thrum, barely audible, more felt than heard. It vibrated through the van's frame, through my teeth, through my bones. I pressed my palms against the floor, desperate for something solid, and realized the vibration wasn't constant. It pulsed, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I squeezed my eyes shut and whispered, "This isn't happening." But the desert didn't let me look away. One of the lights drifted closer to the windshield, close enough that its glow spilled across the dashboard, illuminating cracks I'd never noticed. Dust motes suspended like frozen stars. In that light, the van felt impossibly small, a tin can, a child's hiding place. The internal conflict snapped then, rationality versus instinct, and instinct finally won. I needed to leave. I lunged for the driver's seat, hands shaking so badly I fumbled the keys when I grabbed them from the cup holder. The engine coughed once, twice. The lights pulsed brighter in response, the thrum deepening, pressing into my chest like a warning. "Come on," I begged the van, the desert, myself. "Come on." The engine turned over. As I threw the headlights on, the beams cut through the darkness and stopped dead. The road I'd driven in on was gone, not blocked, not obscured. Gone, swallowed by darkness so complete it looked painted on, a flat wall where depth should have been. The hovering lights shifted, tightening their loose ring, and for the first time since they appeared, they moved together. That was when I realized this wasn't about being seen. It was about being kept. The headlights burned uselessly into that wall of darkness, their beams swallowed without reflection, without dust, without distance, as if the desert had folded in on itself and refused to show me what came next. My foot hovered over the accelerator, muscles locked in indecision, because every instinct screamed that driving forward meant crossing a line I wouldn't be allowed to uncross. The lights pulsed again, once slow and deep, and the van shuddered as if responding to a command. I slammed the gas. The engine roared, tires spinning for a fraction of a second before catching, and the van lurched forward. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the darkness moved. It didn't part or retreat. It slid sideways, revealing the faint suggestion of the dirt road just long enough for me to see it twist wrong, bending at an angle that hadn't existed before. I didn't question it. I drove. The lights surged alongside me, not chasing, not fleeing, but pacing the van with effortless precision. One hovered just off the driver's side window, close enough that I could see subtle variations in its glow. Layers within layers, like depth carved out of light itself. The temperature inside the van plummeted. My breath came out in sharp, panicked bursts, fogging the glass faster than the defroster could clear it. The low thrumming intensified, vibrating through the steering wheel, blurring my vision. My teeth chattered, not from cold alone, but from the adrenaline flooding my system, from the deep, primal understanding that I was no longer in control of my own movement. Every time I tried to veer left or right, the road corrected me, nudging the tires back into alignment as if guided by invisible rails. "This isn't real," I muttered, over and over, the words losing meaning with each repetition. "This isn't real." The desert answered by taking something away. The stars vanished, not gradually, not behind clouds. They blinked out all at once, leaving a sky so black it felt oppressive, pressing down on the van like a physical weight. The headlights dimmed in response, their beams thinning, stretching until they barely illuminated 10 feet ahead. Then the radio crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on. Static hissed, cut with sharp pops, then a voice slipped through. Not clear, not distorted enough to dismiss. Male, calm, too close. "Evan." My hand slipped on the wheel. The van swerved, tires skidding, and one of the lights dipped lower, flaring bright enough to flood the cab in amber. "No," I said aloud. "No, you don't get to do that." I slammed the radio off, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might tear loose. Silence rushed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the thrumming and my own ragged breathing. I tasted copper. I hadn't realized I was biting my tongue. That was the moment denial finally died. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a drone or a trick of desert light. Whatever surrounded me knew my name, and it hadn't learned it from the internet or a license plate. It had learned it from me. The road pitched downward abruptly, the van's suspension groaning as we descended into a shallow basin. The air grew colder, damp in a way the desert air had no right to be. A smell crept in through the vents, wet stone, old soil, something stagnant and ancient. The lights dropped lower too, hovering just above the ground now, illuminating patches of earth that looked disturbed, scuffed, as if something heavy had been dragged across them repeatedly. Panic crested, hot and overwhelming. I needed out of the basin, out of the lights, out of whatever unseen geometry I'd been pulled into. I downshifted and floored it. The van protested, engine whining in a pitch that set my nerves on edge, but it surged forward. The lights reacted instantly, darting ahead, rearranging themselves, forming a loose corridor that narrowed the faster I went. The thrumming rose in pitch, no longer just felt but heard, a layered sound that made my vision double at the edges. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The road leveled out. The darkness receded. Stars punched back into existence overhead, sharp and indifferent. The lights scattered, drifting away in different directions, their glow dimming until they were indistinguishable from distant starlight. I slammed on the brakes. The van skidded to a halt, dust billowing around me. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I sat there with my forehead pressed to the steering wheel, hands clenched so tight my fingers ached, listening to the engine idle, listening for any sign that the nightmare hadn't actually ended. Nothing followed. When I finally looked up, the road ahead was familiar. Rutted dirt, juniper shadows, the faint rise toward the main track that would eventually lead back to pavement. My headlights illuminated it cleanly, honestly, without distortion. I laughed then, a broken, hysterical sound that scraped my throat raw. Relief crashed over me in a dizzying wave, leaving me lightheaded, weak. I didn't slow down again. I didn't stop to think. I drove until the dirt gave way to asphalt, until cell service flickered back to life, until the eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of approaching dawn. I pulled over at a gas station just outside town, parked crookedly, and sat there shaking while the sun bled color back into the world. The smell of ozone lingered in my nose no matter how deeply I breathed. My clothes felt damp with cold sweat. When I finally stepped out of the van, my legs nearly buckled beneath me. A trucker glanced my way, concern flickering across his face, then looked away. To him, I was just another tired traveler who'd pushed too far. I didn't try to explain. I wouldn't have known where to start. I drove straight through Sedona without stopping, the red rocks glowing benign and beautiful in the morning light, betraying nothing. By noon, I was 2 counties away, parked in a crowded RV park where generators hummed and children shouted and the world felt aggressively, overwhelmingly normal. I didn't sleep for nearly 24 hours. When I finally did, it was shallow and broken, haunted by dreams of light pressing in from all sides, of roads that bent away from my control. I woke with the taste of ozone still sharp on my tongue, my name echoing in my ears in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I left Arizona 3 days later. I still camp, I still live out of my van, but I don't chase isolation the way I used to. I don't push past that quiet internal warning just to prove I'm brave or self-sufficient or healed. The desert taught me something that night, not gently, not kindly, but clearly. There are places that don't want witnesses, and there are moments when the most dangerous lie you can tell yourself is that you're alone. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do isn't to face the dark head on. Sometimes it's to leave before the dark decides to face you. I thought leaving Arizona would be enough. Distance feels like protection when you don't want to admit something followed you. For weeks after that night, I stayed in places that were loud on purpose, truck stops, crowded RV parks, rest areas lit so bright they washed the stars out of the sky. I told myself I was just being practical, safer. But the truth was, I couldn't stand silence anymore. Silence had learned my name. Sleep never came clean. When it did, it dragged me under hard and dropped me somewhere shallow and wrong. I'd wake up convinced the van was humming. Not the familiar rattle of aging metal, but that low, measured thrum felt more than heard. I tore panels open looking for loose wires. I blamed the fridge, the battery, anything that had screws I could tighten, anything that could be fixed. Nothing was ever wrong. The first time I saw the light again, I was in eastern Nevada, camped just off a 2-lane highway. Families nearby, campfires, laughter drifting through the sagebrush. I was brushing my teeth outside the van when the temperature dipped, sudden and surgical, like someone had sliced a hole in the air. I froze. The light didn't hover this time. It reflected. A soft amber shimmer rippled across the chrome trim of a nearby RV, faint enough that no one else noticed. It was gone in less than a second, but my knees went weak anyway. I spat toothpaste into the dirt and sat down hard, heart racing, palms slick. That was when the doubt crept back in, more dangerous than fear. You're projecting, I told myself. Trauma does this. Hypervigilance. You read about it. I'd never liked that word, trauma. It felt like something that belonged to other people, people who couldn't handle things. But the desert had cracked something open in me, and now everything slipped through the fracture. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the waiting. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No more voices, no closing corridors of light, just small, unsettling moments that stacked up until they felt intentional. My phone would lose battery faster on clear nights. The compass I kept on the dash would drift, never wildly, just enough to be wrong. I'd catch unfamiliar smells, ozone, wet stone, where they didn't belong. And always, there was the feeling of being measured. I stopped parking with my windows facing open land. I backed into spots, kept my windshield toward trees or buildings or other vehicles. I memorized escape routes without thinking about it, cataloging distances to roads, towns, lights. I became careful in a way that looked calm from the outside but felt like a coiled wire inside my chest. Months passed. Summer bled into fall. By the time I reached northern New Mexico, the fear had dulled into something heavier. Resignation, maybe. Acceptance, the sense that the desert hadn't chased me because it hadn't needed to. It had already left its mark. I was camped near an old volcanic field the night it finally forced the reckoning. The campground was nearly empty. A ranger station a mile away, enough civilization to convince myself I was safe. I cooked dinner, read by lantern light, did everything right. When the sun went down, I locked the doors, shut the curtains, and lay back with my hands folded over my chest, listening to the ordinary sounds of night. The humming started just after midnight, not outside, inside the van. It vibrated up through the floor, through the mattress, into my spine. My breath caught, muscles locking as memories slammed into me with physical force. The air grew cold in uneven waves, brushing my skin like unseen fingers. I didn't look at the windows. I didn't need to. "I know," I whispered into the dark voice, barely steady. "I know you're there." The humming paused. The silence that followed felt deliberate, expectant. I swallowed hard, heart pounding so loud I was sure it gave me away. This wasn't panic anymore. This was exhaustion. Months of running layered over one long night in the Arizona desert, all of it funneling into this moment. "You don't get to keep doing this," I said, "whatever you are." The words surprised me. They weren't brave. They were tired. The temperature dropped another degree. My breath fogged the air, and then, clear as if someone were sitting beside me, the voice returned. Not from the radio, not from outside, from inside my head. Not words this time, not a name, a sensation, pressure behind my eyes, a flood of images that weren't memories but felt adjacent to them, angles that didn't resolve, distances folding into themselves, the sense of vastness compressed into something intimate and invasive. I tasted ozone. I smelled iron. My vision swam. I understood then, in a way that bypassed language, what I'd been resisting since Sedona. It wasn't curiosity that night in the desert. It wasn't malice. It was recognition. The lights hadn't been searching the land. They'd been searching me. The realization cracked something open. Tears slid down my temples, soaking into the pillow, not from fear, but from the sudden crushing weight of being known by something that did not share human boundaries or human mercy. "I can't," I whispered. "I won't." The pressure intensified, testing, probing, and for a terrifying moment I thought I might lose myself entirely, thought my thoughts might scatter the way the lights had, pulled apart and rearranged. So I did the only thing left. I let go of the fight. I grounded myself in the smallest truths I could grasp. The smell of old fabric, the ache in my shoulders, the rhythm of my breathing. I anchored myself to who I was now, not the man who'd driven into isolation looking for answers, but the one who understood the cost of being seen too clearly. "I'm not yours," I said quietly, firmly. "I choose where I stand." The humming wavered. The pressure eased just slightly, like a hand loosening its grip. The cold receded in slow increments. The air evened out, and then, as gently as it had begun, it was over. No dramatic exit, no final display of light, just absence, heavy and complete. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I watched the sky pale toward dawn, every sense stretched thin, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I left New Mexico that morning and didn't look back. It's been years now. I still live on the road, but differently. I camp closer to people. I listen harder to the quiet voice that says this place isn't right, even when I can't explain why. I don't chase the edge anymore. Sometimes, late at night when the world goes still, I feel a faint echo of that hum, like a distant memory vibrating just out of reach. It doesn't frighten me the way it used to. It reminds me. There are forces in this country older than maps and deeper than roads. They don't announce themselves with monsters or miracles. They wait, they observe, and when you wander too far into their silence, they notice. The desert taught me fear, but more than that, it taught me respect. And if you ever find yourself camped under a sky so full of stars it feels crowded and the night grows suddenly, unnaturally cold, trust the unease that rises in your chest. Some lights aren't meant to guide you. Some are only there to see if you'll stay. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to believe me. I tell it because I didn't listen the first time fear tried to speak, and the cost of that silence followed me farther than any road ever could. Years have passed since New Mexico, long enough for the edges of most memories to soften, long enough for pain to become narrative instead of sensation. But that night never dulled. It didn't fade. It settled, like sediment at the bottom of clear water. Invisible until disturbed, I sold the old Volkswagen a year later. People assume it was mechanical trouble, age, mileage, rust. I let them believe that. The truth was harder to say without sounding unhinged. The van felt crowded even when it was empty. Certain nights, when the temperature dipped just enough, I could feel something in the metal, like a memory stored deeper than sound. I didn't hate the van. I was grateful to it. It got me out, but it had been there. Now I drive something newer, quieter, less soul maybe, but fewer places for echoes to hide. I still camp, still chase the open land, still believe there's something sacred about sleeping under a sky untouched by city light. That part of me didn't die in the desert. It just learned restraint. I've met people on the road who dance around similar stories without realizing it. They talk about lost time, about compasses spinning, about nights that feel longer than they should. They laugh while they say it because laughter is safer than admitting unease. I don't interrupt them. I don't correct them. But I listen. And every so often, when someone mentions Sedona or the high desert or a place where the silence feels intentional, I see it in their eyes. That same internal argument I once lost. Curiosity versus instinct. Bravery versus wisdom. I wish I could tell them exactly where the line is. I can't. The desert doesn't draw borders. It doesn't warn you with signs or fences. It lets you walk until you're far enough in that turning back feels like failure. That's how it works. Not just the land, but whatever else shares it. What I learned, finally, is that fear isn't always a call to stand your ground. Sometimes it's a boundary being enforced. That night near Sedona, when the lights hovered and the road bent and the sky went dark all at once, I thought the horror was external, something invading my space, something alien and unknowable pressing in from the outside. But the deeper terror came later, in the quiet realization that the desert hadn't needed to chase me. I had walked straight into its attention. There's a particular kind of humility that comes from understanding how small you are, not in a poetic way, not in the way people talk about stars and perspective, but in a visceral, undeniable sense. The kind that strips you of the belief that every mystery exists for your consumption. Some things don't want to be understood. Some places don't want to be known. And when you ignore that truth, when you mistake access for permission, the land has ways of reminding you. I still remember the exact shade of amber those lights burned. Not bright like fire, not cold like LEDs, something in between. Patient, observant, the color of a question that doesn't need an answer right away. I remember the smell more than anything, the way ozone cut through the desert air, sharp and wrong, like reality itself had been scored open. Even now, if I catch that scent before a storm, my body reacts before my mind does. Heart rate up, muscles tight, exit routes mapped without conscious thought. That's the part no one tells you about experiences like this. They don't end. They integrate. The desert took something from me that night. My casual confidence, my belief that solitude is always benign. But it gave me something too, though I didn't recognize it as a gift at first. Discernment, the ability to feel when a place is empty and when it's merely quiet. So if you're out there someday, parked miles from the nearest light, proud of how far you've gone off grid, thrilled by the idea that you're completely alone, listen closely to what your body is telling you. Listen to the way the silence sits. Listen to the way the cold moves. And if the night feels like it's watching instead of sleeping, don't wait for proof. Don't wait for lights. Don't wait for your name to be spoken by something that doesn't use mouths. Pack up. Leave. Because the most dangerous places aren't the ones that threaten you openly. They're the ones that let you stay just long enough to believe you were invited. And if you ever see lights hovering over your campsite, steady, silent, unhurried, remember this. The desert doesn't reveal itself by accident. It reveals you. And once it does, the only victory left is knowing when to go. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold. It was the silence, the kind that presses inward, like the world has stopped breathing and is waiting to see if you will. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was 36 that winter, and I'd spent enough nights in a Volkswagen camper to believe I understood solitude. I'd driven that old VW through deserts that hummed with heat and forests that never quite slept, places where the night felt alive in a friendly way. Banff in January was different. The silence there didn't feel empty. It felt observant. We'd parked late the night before, long after the sun had vanished behind the Canadian Rockies. Snow had been falling in slow, steady sheets, thick enough to swallow sound, to erase tire tracks behind us as if the road itself wanted no memory of our arrival. The campground was technically open, but deserted, off-season quiet, the kind of place locals warned you about with a shrug and a half smile. I remember brushing that off. I always did. I told myself that nature had moods, and this was just one of them. Inside the VW, the heater clicked and sighed like an old man settling into bed. Condensation clung to the windows, blurring the world beyond into pale shapes and shadows. I was traveling with Marissa, someone I loved deeply but didn't always know how to protect. That was the emotional weight I carried into Banff, the quiet fear of failing someone else, not myself. I'd promised her this trip would be safe, restorative. I believed that promise mattered more than my instincts. Sometime in the early hours, I woke to a sound that felt out of place. Not loud, not sudden, just wrong. A dull pressure, like snow sliding off a branch and landing against metal. Then nothing. The heater cycled. My breath fogged the air. I lay there listening, my mind trying to file the sound under something harmless. Wind, wildlife. The park was full of animals that moved like ghosts. Marissa stirred beside me and whispered my name, her voice thin with sleep. "You hear that?" she asked. I said no. Not because I hadn't, but because once you say yes, you invite something into the space between you. I didn't want fear to take root there. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sunrise, just a gradual lifting of darkness into a dim blue-gray light. I checked my phone. 6:10 a.m. The temperature outside was brutal, well below freezing. Overnight, the storm had finished its work. Snow lay smooth and untouched around us, a perfect white sheet stretching to the trees. That should have felt peaceful. I slid out of the driver's seat and pulled on my boots, the cold biting immediately through the thin rubber soles. When I opened the side door, the air hit me like a slap, sharp, clean, and painfully alive. My breath came out in thick clouds hanging in front of my face before drifting away. That's when I saw them. At first, my brain refused to assemble the image correctly. It tried to turn it into something familiar. Smudges, melt patterns, snow clinging unevenly to the paint. Then I stepped closer. Handprints, 5 fingers, a palm, another set beside it, pressed into the frost on the side of the VW just below the window. They were fresh, so fresh that the heat from the skin had slightly melted the snow, leaving dark, wet impressions against the pale metal. Adult-sized, bare hands. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't weather. This was intention. I didn't move for a long time. The world felt tilted, like gravity had shifted just enough to make standing difficult. I scanned the ground instinctively, expecting footprints leading away, some sign of direction or distance. There were none. The snow around the RV was pristine. No tracks, no disturbances. Just us, parked in the middle of a white emptiness, and those handprints, proof that someone had been close enough to touch us, close enough to feel the warmth inside the vehicle, close enough to know we were there. Behind me, Marissa asked softly, "What is it?" I didn't answer right away. I was trying to decide who I needed to be in that moment. The man who acknowledged danger or the man who kept the people he loved calm. I chose wrong. "It's nothing," I said, probably from yesterday, before the storm. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they didn't fit. The storm had buried everything. Those prints had appeared after the snow fell, after we went to sleep. She stepped out beside me anyway, pulling her coat tight, and I watched her see the truth in the same slow, dawning way I had. Her face changed, not into panic, but into something quieter. Suspicion, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. "Ethan," she said. Someone touched the van. I nodded. The air felt thinner now, harder to breathe. I forced myself to examine the prints like evidence instead of a threat. The height suggested someone standing close, leaning in, curious, listening. The placement, near the window, made my skin crawl. Whoever it was hadn't been pushing. They'd been steadying themselves, as if they were trying to see inside. The environment seemed to respond to my thoughts. The trees creaked faintly as they shifted under the weight of snow. Somewhere far off, a sound echoed, maybe wind moving through a ravine, maybe something else entirely. In Banff, distance plays tricks on sound. Everything feels closer than it is. I walked slowly around the vehicle, my boots crunching too loudly in the quiet. The back doors were untouched. The front was clean. Only the passenger side bore those marks, like a message written in cold. My mind raced through explanations, each one less convincing than the last. A ranger? No reason. Another camper? No tracks. A local playing a joke? In this weather, in this isolation? Denial is comfortable. It keeps you warm, but it also makes you slow. Inside the van, the smell of damp fabric and old coffee felt suddenly suffocating. Every sound, the click of the heater, the faint whistle of wind through a seam, took on new meaning. I realized how thin the walls were, how little separated us from whatever had been outside in the dark. Marissa sat on the bench seat, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the window where the prints still showed through the glass. "Did you lock the doors?" she asked. "Yes," I said, too quickly. I remembered the sound I'd heard in the night, the dull pressure, snow sliding off a branch. I wasn't sure anymore. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, through rational thought, through memory, through the quiet realization that the environment wasn't just a backdrop. It was complicit. The cold preserved evidence, the snow erased paths, the silence hid movement. Banff wasn't threatening us directly. It was offering cover. I told myself we should leave, pack up, drive out as soon as possible. But another part of me hesitated. The stubborn pride that had kept me safe in other places, the belief that panic was more dangerous than patience. That hesitation would cost me more than I understood at the time. As I reached for the keys, a new sound drifted through the air, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Not a knock, not a voice, footsteps, slow, careful, circling the van, and this time there was no denying it. The footsteps didn't rush us. That was the worst part. They moved with a patience that felt practiced, compressing the snow in a slow, deliberate rhythm, close enough that I could tell the weight was human. No uneven gait, no skittering hesitation like an animal testing ground. Each step landed, paused, then landed again, as if whoever it was wanted us to know they were there without giving us the courtesy of speed. Marissa's eyes locked onto mine. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Fear had already stripped conversation down to essentials. My hand hovered near the door latch, not because I planned to open it, but because I needed to know where my body was in relation to escape, to resistance, to anything other than helplessness. The environment pressed in tighter. The cold seeped through the metal floor, climbed my calves, and settled in my knees like something alive. The windows, fogged moments earlier, were now clear enough to see movement. Shadows sliding across white, bending and stretching as the figure passed from one side of the van to the other. No face, no features. Just a human outline briefly intersecting the pale light of morning. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped near the passenger door, right where the handprints were. A pause, long enough for my thoughts to turn feral. Long enough for me to imagine fingers curling around the handle, testing it the way someone tests a wound, curious, gentle, almost respectful. I realized then how thin the concept of locked really was. A piece of metal, a mechanism, a suggestion. I forced myself to speak, my voice low and steady in a way I didn't feel. "Hey," I said, "this is private property. We're leaving." The words sounded ridiculous the moment they left my mouth. Private property. In a national park, in the middle of winter. The silence that followed swallowed them whole. Then came the sound I'd been dreading. Not the rattle of the handle, but something worse. Breathing. Right outside the door. close enough that the faint fog of it bloomed against the glass, a soft circular cloud that appeared and faded, perfectly in time with slow inhalations. Whoever it was stood still, listening to us the same way we were listening to them. Marissa squeezed my arm hard enough to hurt. I welcomed the pain. It anchored me. Every instinct I had screamed to leave. Start the engine. Don't think. Move. But fear has a way of convincing you that stillness is safety, that motion will provoke whatever is waiting. I hated myself for hesitating, for calculating risk while someone stood inches away from the person I loved. A knock came then. Not loud, not aggressive, just one soft, deliberate tap against the metal. It echoed inside the van like a gunshot. Marissa let out a small sound, half gasp, half sob, and covered her mouth. I felt something inside me fracture. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. This wasn't someone lost or confused. This was someone who understood exactly how vulnerable we were and was choosing to approach slowly, methodically, savoring the imbalance of power. I leaned forward and pressed my forehead briefly against the steering wheel, grounding myself in its familiar texture, the cracked vinyl worn smooth by years of travel. I thought about every time I'd ignored a gut feeling because it was inconvenient. Every time I'd told myself fear was just imagination. The second knock came, slightly firmer this time. I reached for the keys and turned them in one motion. The engine coughed, protested, then roared to life, shattering the quiet. The sudden noise felt violent, like tearing fabric. Outside, the shadow flinched back, retreating just enough to confirm what I'd feared all along. This wasn't wildlife. This wasn't the park. This was a person who knew how to wait. I slammed the van into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun uselessly for a moment, screaming against packed snow. Panic surged hot and sharp in my chest. The van lurched, fishtailed, then finally caught traction, jerking forward hard enough to throw us back against our seats. I didn't look in the mirrors at first. I couldn't. I was afraid of what I'd see, and afraid of what it would mean if I saw nothing at all. As we pulled away, I glanced back. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by trees. Average height, heavy coat, no visible markings, no attempt to chase us. Just watching, hands at their sides, head tilted slightly, as if committing our departure to memory. That image followed me for miles. The road out of the campground twisted through dense forest, the trees closing in like spectators leaning toward a stage. My hands shook on the wheel, adrenaline making every movement jerky, overcorrected. Marissa stared straight ahead, her face pale, lips pressed together so tightly they'd gone white. Neither of us spoke until the trees thinned and the park road opened up, revealing a distant ranger station dusted with snow. Only then did she whisper, "They knew we were there." It wasn't a question. I nodded. Saying anything else would have been a lie. We stopped at the ranger station and reported what happened. The ranger listened carefully, his expression calm but alert in a way that told me this wasn't new territory for him. He asked about the handprints, about the lack of tracks, about the knock. When we finished, he leaned back slightly and exhaled through his nose. "Winter brings people out here who don't want to be seen," he said. "Isolation works both ways." He didn't offer a neat explanation. No arrest, no comforting story about pranksters or misunderstandings, just a quiet acknowledgement that the wilderness doesn't screen its visitors, and neither do the people who hide within it. We left Banff that day without finishing the trip. The mountains faded in the rearview mirror, beautiful and indifferent, their silence unchanged by what had happened within them. The fear didn't disappear when we crossed the park boundary. It stayed with us, settling into quieter places. For me, the lesson came slowly, over months. I realized how often I'd treated discomfort as something to overcome rather than information to respect. How my confidence had sometimes been a form of arrogance. I'd wanted to believe that preparation and experience made me immune to being watched, to being vulnerable. That morning taught me otherwise. When you camp in places like that, when you bring a warm lit box into a cold watching landscape, you announce yourself. You become a beacon. Most of the time, The only thing listening is the wind, but sometimes someone listens back. Now, when I park the VW and the night grows quiet, I pay attention to the quality of the silence. I trust the small internal alarms I used to ignore. And if something feels wrong, if the quiet presses too hard, if the air feels expectant, I don't wait for proof. Because the scariest thing about those handprints wasn't that someone touched our van. It was that they stood there long enough to decide how close they wanted to get. We didn't talk much for the rest of that day. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything we might say felt too fragile to survive being spoken. Words have a way of flattening experiences like that, turning sharp edges into stories you can tell at dinner parties. Neither of us wanted that yet. Maybe we never would. The road stretched on, gray and wet beneath the tires, the mountains slowly loosening their grip on the horizon. I drove on autopilot, hands steady now but hollow, like the shaking had burned itself out and left only fatigue behind. Marissa leaned her forehead against the window, watching snowfields slide past, her reflection ghosted faintly over the glass. It wasn't until we stopped for fuel hours later, surrounded by other cars, other voices, that the weight of what had happened finally settled fully into my body. Safety didn't bring relief. It brought a delayed collapse. My knees felt weak when I stepped out of the van. The smell of gasoline, sharp and chemical, made my stomach turn. Ordinary sounds felt too loud, too close. A man laughed somewhere behind me, and I flinched before I could stop myself. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. The fear hadn't stayed in Banff. We'd carried it with us. That night, parked in a crowded rest area under harsh sodium lights, I couldn't sleep. Every time my eyes closed, I saw breath fogging against glass, heard that soft, measured knock. My mind replayed the moment again and again, searching for signs I'd missed, decisions I could have made differently. I kept coming back to the same point, not the handprints, not the footsteps, but the sound I'd heard in the night and dismissed. Snow sliding off a branch. That lie had been for my own comfort. And comfort, I realized, is dangerous when it teaches you to ignore yourself. Marissa woke at some point and found me sitting upright, staring at nothing. She didn't ask what I was thinking. She just took my hand. Her fingers were cold, even inside the van, and I held them tighter than necessary, grounding myself in the reality of another human being choosing to be there with me. "I trusted you," she said quietly. "Not as an accusation, as a truth." "I know," I answered. My voice cracked on the word. That trust was the heaviest thing I carried away from Banff. Not because it was broken, but because it had survived, and survival comes with responsibility. In the weeks that followed, the story began to change shape in my mind. At first, it was vivid and immediate, every detail sharp enough to cut. Then it started to soften around the edges, as memories do. The environment faded first, the trees, the snow, the cold, until what remained was the feeling. Being watched, being measured, being found. I researched, quietly, obsessively. I learned about off-season transients who drift through national parks when tourists disappear. People who use the vastness and the weather as cover. I learned about how sound travels differently in snow, how footsteps can seem closer or farther than they are. None of it explained the lack of tracks. None of it explained the patience. And maybe that was the point. Not every threat wants to be understood. Some only want proximity. Months later, we were back on the road because fear can't be allowed to decide the shape of your life. But we traveled differently. We planned exits. We trusted discomfort. If a place felt wrong, we didn't debate it. We left. No pride. No rationalization. Just movement. One evening, parked in a forest far from Banff, far from snow, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The air was warm, alive with insects and distant water. Still, when the light shifted and shadows lengthened, my chest tightened reflexively. Trauma teaches your body lessons your mind doesn't get to forget. I walked around the van out of habit now, checking windows, doors, surroundings, and for a brief, irrational moment, my breath caught because the side panel was smudged. Not handprints, just dirt, just life. But my reaction told me everything I needed to know about how deeply that morning had marked me. I cleaned the panel slowly, deliberately, feeling the cool metal under my palm. Touch can be grounding when fear has made everything else feel unreal. As I worked, I thought about how thin the line is between adventure and exposure, between solitude and isolation. RV camping, I realized, isn't about escaping the world. It's about meeting it without walls thick enough to pretend you're invincible. That morning in Banff stripped something away from me, the illusion that experience equals control, the belief that bad things announce themselves clearly. They don't. They whisper, they test, they wait for you to decide whether you're listening. The environment taught me that lesson, but a person delivered it. I don't know who stood outside our van. I don't know what they wanted. Sometimes not knowing is worse than any explanation you could invent. It leaves space your mind fills at 3 a.m, space that breathes when the night gets too quiet. But I do know this: fear doesn't always come to stop you. Sometimes it comes to sharpen you. Now, when I tell people about that trip, I don't frame it as a horror story. I frame it as a warning wrapped in snow and silence. I talk about how the wilderness isn't evil, but it doesn't protect you either, and how the most dangerous thing you can bring into a remote place isn't lack of gear, it's arrogance. If you camp long enough, you'll learn that the land listens, and occasionally so do the people moving through it unseen. You don't have to be paranoid to be prepared. You just have to respect the moment when your instincts speak quietly and ask for your attention, because sometimes the difference between a story you tell later and one that ends in the dark is whether you choose to listen before the knock comes a second time. There are moments that don't fade with time. They change shape, sink deeper, and resurface when you least expect them. Banff became one of those moments for me. Not a place on a map anymore, but a pressure behind the ribs, a memory my body recalls faster than my mind. Years passed. The Volkswagen aged the way all loyal things do. More rattles, more quirks, more stories etched into metal and fabric. Marissa and I stayed together, though something between us shifted after that winter morning. Not damaged, clarified. When you face a quiet threat together, you learn exactly what kind of silence the other person carries. We never camped in deep winter again. That decision wasn't fear talking, it was respect, for the way cold strips away margins for error, for how isolation sharpens intent. I stopped chasing the most remote spots just to prove I could reach them. I stopped confusing loneliness with peace. But the memory waited patiently. It came back one night in Utah, years later, parked on BLM land miles from the nearest town. No snow, no forest, just open desert and a sky littered with stars. The quiet was vast, but different, expansive instead of pressing. Still, when the wind died suddenly, my chest tightened. Silence, I'd learned, has dialects. I stepped outside to relieve myself, boots crunching softly on gravel. The night smelled of dust and cold stone. The van sat behind me, a dark silhouette against the horizon. And for a split second, just a fraction of one, I felt it again. That sense of being assessed. I froze, every muscle locked, listening past the obvious sounds, past the wind and my own breathing. Nothing moved, nothing revealed itself. The feeling passed, leaving behind a familiar mix of embarrassment and relief. But instead of brushing it off, I packed up and left. That was the real change. Not fear, but responsiveness. On the drive out, headlights carving tunnels through the dark, I thought about the person in Banff, how they'd stood there, breathing against the glass, unhurried. I wondered if they'd been disappointed when we left, or satisfied, or if we were just one warm box among many they'd encountered and forgotten. The question didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this: I'd finally stopped needing answers from things that never intended to give them. The environment teaches you if you're willing to be a student. Snow preserves what happens. Desert erases it. Forests hide. Mountains watch. Each place asks something different of you. Banff asked humility, and it demanded it without raising its voice. I think about that morning sometimes when people romanticize RV life, the freedom, the escape, the idea of being untethered. I understand the appeal. I felt it too. But there's another truth that doesn't fit neatly into highlight reels. When you travel this way, you are visible. You glow in the dark, you hum with warmth, you smell like food and sleep and vulnerability. Most of the time, that means nothing. Most of the time, the only witnesses are stars and trees and passing weather, but not always. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you brave. It makes you careless. Marissa once asked me, long after Banff, if I thought we were ever really in danger that morning. The question lingered between us as the miles rolled by, the van steady and familiar beneath us. Yes, I said, but not for the reason people think. She waited. We were in danger the moment I ignored what I felt, I continued. Everything after that was just confirmation. She nodded slowly. She understood. She always did. That's the part I carry forward now. The understanding that fear isn't the enemy. It's a language, one we're taught to silence, to outgrow, to dismiss as weakness. But fear, when it's quiet and precise, is often the most honest thing in the room. The handprints on the van didn't haunt me because they were frightening. They haunted me because they were gentle, careful, deliberate. Whoever left them wasn't frantic. They weren't lost. They were present. A human presence intersecting ours in a way that felt intimate without consent. That kind of proximity changes you. It teaches you that danger doesn't always crash through doors. Sometimes it waits outside, breathing softly, curious how much you're willing to notice. I still camp. I still chase horizons and sleep inches from the ground, wrapped in thin walls and thinner assumptions, but I listen differently now. I pay attention to the moments when the night feels too aware, when the quiet leans in instead of spreading out, and when I find fresh marks where none should be. Tracks, sounds, signs that don't belong. I don't negotiate with myself anymore. I don't look for comfort in explanations that feel good. I leave. Because survival, I've learned, isn't about toughness. It's about timing. That morning in Banff ended without violence, without headlines, without answers, just a set of melting handprints on cold metal, erased by sunlight before anyone else could see them. But I saw them, and I'll never forget what it felt like to realize that someone else had been close enough to touch our shelter and patient enough to wait. Some lessons don't need closure. They just need to be remembered, quietly, clearly, and in time. The first time I heard my name in the woods, it didn't sound threatening. It sounded familiar, like memory trying to pass for comfort. My name is Ethan Cole, and in June of 2021, I was 36 years old, driving a sun-faded Volkswagen camper I'd rebuilt myself, the kind with chipped enamel and a stubborn engine that taught patience better than any book ever could. I had learned to trust the road more than people and forests more than cities, because trees don't lie. They just stand where they are and let you decide what you're going to believe. Ocala National Forest wasn't a spontaneous choice. I'd circled it on a map months earlier, the way you circle a word you can't pronounce yet but want to learn. Central Florida gets a bad reputation, flat, humid, forgettable, but Ocala has a spine to it. Springs that breathe cold air into summer heat, pines that creak like old boats, palmetto scrub thick enough to swallow sound. It's not loud wilderness. It's the quiet kind that watches. I rolled in late afternoon, humidity pressing through the open windows like a damp hand on my chest. The forest road narrowed into sand, then into something that felt less like a road and more like a suggestion. I passed locals fishing off culverts, an old man in a faded gator's cap who lifted 2 fingers from his steering wheel when I drove by. It felt polite, normal, reassuring in that shallow way that only lasts until the sun starts thinking about leaving. I chose a dispersed site, not an official campground. That mattered to me. I liked the honesty of it. No numbers, no neighbors, no rules beyond the ones you enforce on yourself. I parked the Volkswagen beneath longleaf pines, needles crunching under the tires, the engine ticking itself cool like it was catching its breath. The air smelled of sap and wet earth and something faintly sour beneath it, a rot I told myself was just leaf litter doing what leaf litter does. I cooked dinner on the little propane stove, beans and rice, the sound of cicadas winding up like machinery. As dusk fell, the forest changed its posture. The heat loosened, the light drained away, and the space between things grew thicker. Sound traveled differently. Every footstep felt louder than it should have been. I noticed how the shadows didn't move with the breeze. They just waited. I told myself I was reading too much into it. That was my flaw back then. Denial dressed up as rational thinking. I had learned over years of camping alone how to downplay instincts when they threatened convenience. It was easier to explain away discomfort than to tear down camp and admit you'd been wrong. By 10, the forest had settled into a steady rhythm. Frogs clicking, an owl calling from somewhere I couldn't place. I lay in the Volkswagen's narrow bed, windows cracked, fan humming softly. The smell inside was old canvas and oil and the faint sweetness of pine sap I'd tracked in on my boots. I drifted in and out of sleep, the kind that feels shallow no matter how long you lie still. That's when the sound started. At first, it was just a voice-shaped absence, a pause in the night where something should have been. Then, clear as if someone stood 10 feet from my door, I heard it. Ethan. Not shouted, not whispered. Spoken the way someone says your name when they already know you're listening. My eyes snapped open. The fan kept turning. The frogs kept clicking. Nothing else changed. My heart thudded once, hard enough to hurt. I didn't move. I waited for the echo, for the follow-up, for my brain to offer me a reasonable explanation. Locals sometimes camp out here. People get lost. Sound carries weird at night. 100 explanations lined up, all thin, all unconvincing. Then it came again. Ethan. Closer this time, or maybe just clearer. My mouth went dry. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed, but didn't turn it on. Light can be an invitation. I listened instead, straining to catch footsteps, breath, anything that would give the voice a body. There was nothing. No crunch of pine needles, no movement through brush, just the voice, placed precisely where my name would do the most damage. I told myself not to answer. That rule had been burned into me since childhood, back when my father used to say the woods don't need your permission to take something from you. Answering was a way of giving consent. So I stayed silent, every muscle locked, counting my breaths like that could anchor me. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time and fear doesn't behave. The forest resumed its sounds as if nothing had interrupted them. I lay there, listening until my heartbeat slowed, until embarrassment crept in behind the fear. You're tired, I told myself. You're alone. Your brain filled in a blank. I must have fallen asleep again because the next thing I remember was the smell. It slid into my dream and woke me with it, something coppery and sweet, like rusted metal left in the rain. My eyes opened to darkness thicker than before. The fan was off. The air felt heavier, as if the forest had leaned closer while I slept. Outside, something shifted, a slow drag through underbrush. Not an animal's quick dart or cautious step. This was deliberate, patient. I sat up, pulse spiking. My hand closed around the flashlight, and this time I turned it on, sweeping the beam across the inside of the van first, as if something could have materialized there without my noticing. Canvas walls glowed pale. My breath fogged faintly. Another sound cut through the night. A knock, not on the van, on wood. 3 slow taps spaced evenly apart coming from somewhere just beyond the trees. Tap, tap, tap. Each one landed with intention, like punctuation. My stomach twisted. Nobody knocks in the woods unless they expect an answer. I stayed still, the beam of my flashlight frozen on the door handle, my mind flipping through scenarios faster than I could settle on one. Lost hiker, prank, someone messing with campers. All of them required the same response, to open the door, to speak, to make myself known. The taps came again, closer now, and I realized with a cold clarity that they weren't coming from a tree. They were coming from the side of my Volkswagen. Tap, tap, tap. The metal skin vibrated faintly with each contact. Whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was, knew how to test the space between us without crossing it. I held my breath. The smell outside thickened, that copper-sweet rot pressing through the cracked windows. My mind screamed to start the engine, to flood the night with noise and light, but another voice, quieter, crueler, told me that noise draws attention, and attention is currency you can't always afford. Then, inches from the driver's side window, so close I could feel the vibration of breath against the glass, the voice returned. Ethan, I know you're in there. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't distorted. It carried no obvious threat. That was the worst part. It sounded like someone trying not to scare me. My chest tightened until it hurt. Every instinct I had ever ignored clawed its way to the surface at once, demanding to be heard, demanding I choose between the safety I imagined and the danger I could finally feel. Outside, fingers slid slowly along the metal of the van, nails dragging just enough to make sound, tracing the outline of my shelter as if memorizing it. I realized then that the forest wasn't just listening, it was waiting. The fingers stopped moving, and in that silence I understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever stood outside my Volkswagen didn't need to rush. It already had time on its side. I stayed frozen, flashlight clenched so hard my hand ached. The beam trembled against the door, catching scratches in the paint I didn't remember making. The smell outside grew stronger, thick enough to taste, and my thoughts began to splinter. I told myself to breathe, to think, but fear isn't loud, it's patient. It convinces you that stillness is safety even when it isn't. Ethan, the voice said again, softer now, as if adjusting its tone after realizing the first one hadn't worked. I just want to talk. That word talk settled into me like a hook. Talking means connection. Talking means agreement. Talking means you exist in the same reality as the thing asking for your voice. I shook my head slowly as if the voice could see me refusing. I did not answer. I didn't even swallow. Outside, footsteps shifted, not circling, not pacing, testing. The ground gave faintly beneath weight that sounded wrong somehow, too measured, like each step was being placed after careful thought. I had camped long enough to know the difference between animals moving through brush and something upright trying to stay quiet. My mind reached desperately for denial again. Someone messing with me. Locals. Drunk teenagers. But teenagers laugh. People cough. People make mistakes. This presence didn't waste sound. The knock came again, this time on the rear door. Tap, 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 tap. I flinched despite myself, the flashlight beam jerking upward. The inside of the van felt suddenly too small, canvas walls bowing inward, air thinning. My heart hammered so hard I was certain it could be heard outside. I know you can hear me, the voice said. It wasn't coaxing anymore. It wasn't friendly. It carried a faint impatience now, like someone humoring a stubborn child. You don't want to be alone out here. That did it. Something inside me snapped. Not into courage, but into motion. I slid into the driver's seat, movements sharp and clumsy, keys already in my hand because some instinct had known to keep them there. My foot hovered over the gas as I turned the ignition. The engine coughed once. Outside, the footsteps lunged closer, too fast now, restraint discarded. Something slammed against the side of the van, not hard enough to dent it, but hard enough to rock it, to make the suspension groan. The engine coughed again. Ethan, the voice snapped, sharp as a crack of wood. Gone was the calm. Gone was the pretense. Don't do that. I turned the key a third time and the Volkswagen roared to life, headlights flooding the forest in a sudden, blinding wash of white. Pines leapt out of darkness. Palmettos froze mid-sway. For half a second, I thought I saw a shape just beyond the beam's edge, tall, wrong, pulling back as light touched it, but then I was slamming the van into gear. The tires spun in the sand, engines screaming, and for a horrifying moment I thought I was stuck. Something scraped along the side again, faster now, deliberate damage in every sound. I mashed the gas harder, feeling the wheels finally bite, the van lurching forward. The forest road unfurled in front of me like a tunnel, branches whipping past close enough to scrape paint. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see if anything followed. I just drove, hands locked white around the wheel, heart trying to claw its way out of my chest. Behind me, something howled, not an animal sound, not human either. It rose and fell, stretching itself to fill the space I was leaving, frustration wrapped in noise. It followed for longer than it should have, echoing between trees, pacing the van even as I gained speed. Only when the road widened and the trees thinned did the sound finally break apart, dissolving back into the night like it had never been there. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't slow until I saw a gas station's fluorescent lights bleeding into the dark. I pulled into the lot and killed the engine. The sudden quiet so abrupt, I sat there shaking, hands still on the wheel, breath coming in ragged pulls. My body was buzzing with adrenaline. Every nerve lit up, refusing to settle. The smell clung to the van, copper and rot, and I realized with a sick drop in my stomach that it hadn't all come from outside. There were marks on the paint. Long, shallow lines running parallel along the side, too even to be branches, too deliberate to be an accident. I stared at them until my vision blurred, trying to fit them into a version of reality that didn't involve what my instincts were screaming. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until dawn, parking at a rest stop where families were already stirring, children laughing, engines idling. Normal sounds, safe sounds. When the sun finally rose, it felt less like comfort and more like exposure, light revealing how close I'd come to disappearing into a story no one would ever finish telling. In the days that followed, I replayed the night over and over, looking for mistakes. I told myself I shouldn't have camped alone, shouldn't have chosen a dispersed site, shouldn't have ignored the feeling I'd had as the sun went down, that subtle pressure at the back of my neck that said, leave. But the hardest truth was this. I had heard my name, and some part of me had wanted to answer, wanted to believe that familiarity meant safety, that recognition meant connection. The forest had used that against me, bending something human into a tool. I left Florida early, took the long way north, avoiding forests at night, parking only where there were other people, other voices. For a while, every sound outside the van made my chest tighten. Every knock, real or imagined, sent my pulse racing. Over time, the fear dulled, but it never vanished. It settled into something quieter, heavier. A lesson learned the hard way. The woods don't need your trust. They don't need your curiosity. And when something in the dark uses your name, it isn't reaching out, it's reaching in. I still camp. I still drive that old Volkswagen. But now I listen differently. I don't argue with instincts anymore. I don't stay when the air feels wrong, when the quiet presses too close, when the forest seems to lean in and wait. Because some voices don't want to talk. They want permission. I didn't realize how much of that night followed me until weeks later, when silence itself started to feel loud. I was parked outside a small state park in Georgia, dawn just beginning to rinse the sky pale blue, and I caught myself flinching at the sound of my own breath inside the Volkswagen. The van hadn't changed. The road hadn't changed. I had. Something in me had learned a new language, one written in absence and pressure instead of sound. People like to think fear fades when danger is gone. That's not how it works. Fear just changes jobs. It stops screaming and starts whispering. It becomes watchful, analytical. It waits. I kept driving north, but the forest followed me in pieces. Tree lines along highways, shadows pooling under overpasses, the smell of damp earth after rain. Every place felt like it was borrowing from Ocala, like the land itself shared memory the way people do. I slept lightly, always with the keys in my hand now, always positioned so I could see the door. I told myself it was preparedness, not paranoia. Another rationalization, another compromise. One night, somewhere near the Carolinas, I finally stopped pretending. I was sitting in the driver's seat, engine off, campground quiet except for wind moving through leaves, and I felt it again. That pressure. Not panic, not dread. Just that subtle insistence that something was off. No voices this time, no footsteps, just the sense that the space around me had expectations. I almost ignored it. That was the moment that scared me most. Not the idea that something was there, but how easily I could still talk myself into staying. How familiarity with fear can turn it into background noise if you let it. I packed up and left without hesitation, tires crunching gravel, heart steady instead of racing. As I pulled away, I understood something I hadn't in Ocala. The lesson wasn't about escape. It was about listening early. Back in Florida, I had waited for proof, for escalation, for something undeniable. But the truth is, the forest had warned me long before the voice spoke my name. The unease at dusk, the way sound behaved wrong, the smell that didn't belong. Those weren't mysteries, they were messages. We're taught to override those messages, to be polite, to be brave, to assume the world is neutral until it proves otherwise. But the wild doesn't operate on politeness. It operates on balance. And when something disrupts that balance, your body knows before your mind catches up. I started researching Ocala after that, not looking for explanations, but patterns. I found stories buried in forums and local reports, campers hearing voices mimicking loved ones, hunters followed by footsteps that stopped when they turned around, people waking to find handprints on tents, like prints too large or too evenly spaced to belong to animals. Most of the stories ended the same way, with someone leaving early, embarrassed by fear, unsure whether anything really happened. That uncertainty is the forest's greatest weapon. It doesn't need to hurt you to haunt you. It just needs to make you doubt your own perception. I never went back to Ocala. Some places don't need revisiting. They've already said what they needed to say. But I carried the lesson forward into every mile after. I stopped treating intuition like a suggestion and started treating it like data. I learned to read environments the way you read people, not by what they show you, but by what they withhold. Silence can be a statement. Stillness can be a warning. And I stopped camping alone at night unless I felt absolutely anchored in the space. That doesn't mean comfortable. It means clear. There's a difference. Sometimes late at night, when the road is empty and the trees press close on either side, I think about that voice, how carefully it chose my name, how it used familiarity instead of force, how it waited for me to give something back. That's the part that stays with me. The realization that danger doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it asks questions. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. Sometimes it knows exactly how to sound like it belongs. We like to imagine the wilderness as either beautiful or brutal, but rarely intelligent. That's a mistake. The land remembers. It adapts. And every once in a while, it tests the people who pass through it, not to punish them, but to see if they're paying attention. I survived that night not because I was stronger or braver than anyone else, but because at the last moment I stopped negotiating with doubt. I chose action over explanation. I chose movement over manners. That choice changed how I move through the world. Now when I camp, I don't just set up my van, I introduce myself to the place. I listen, I observe. And if the environment pushes back, even gently, I don't argue. I don't stay to prove something. I leave. Because the truth is this: the forest doesn't call your name to be friendly. It calls to see if you'll answer, to see if you'll step closer, to see if you'll mistake recognition for safety. And if you're out there someday, parked beneath tall pines, night settling in, air thick with sound and scent, and you hear a voice that knows you a little too well, remember this: you don't owe the dark your curiosity. You don't owe the woods your voice. And survival isn't about fearlessness. It's about respect. Some places don't want to be understood. They just want to know if you'll listen.